Teresa Calloway had $37 in her checking account the morning the eviction notice appeared on her door. She found it at 6:15, still in her robe, reaching out of habit for a newspaper she'd canceled 2 months ago. The yellow paper was folded once and taped to the door frame. She pulled it free and stood on the porch reading it in the cold November air, her bare feet going numb on the concrete step, her breath making small white clouds in the gray Ohio morning. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 30 days. She had 30 days to vacate the property she'd rented for the past 4 years. She read it twice, folded it along its original crease, and carried it inside. She set it on the kitchen counter beside a pile of other papers. She'd been working up the courage to open a past-due electric notice, a letter from Gracie's school about unpaid lunch debt, 2 credit card statements. She'd been sliding to the bottom of the stack every morning for 6 weeks. She filled the coffee maker and stood at the counter watching it brew, and then she heard the shuffle of small feet in the hallway and turned around. Gracie was 7 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and an almost uncanny ability to read a room. She stood in the kitchen doorway in her dinosaur pajamas, 1 sock on and 1 missing, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers that had lost an ear in the wash 2 years ago and never recovered. She looked at her mother. She looked at the papers on the counter. "Bad news day?" she asked. Teresa managed a smile. "Just a regular Tuesday." Gracie considered this with the particular seriousness only 7-year-olds bring to a Tuesday morning. Then she pattered across the kitchen floor, climbed into her usual chair, and announced that Mr. Whiskers wanted pancakes. Teresa made pancakes. She made them from the box mix because the good recipe required buttermilk, and she'd stopped buying buttermilk when the grocery budget tightened in August. She made them the way Gracie liked, small and slightly thick, and set them on the table with the last of the maple syrup and watched her daughter eat and tried not to do math in her head. The math was not good. The math had not been good for 8 months. Most mornings started like this. Teresa would get up before Gracie, stand at the kitchen counter in the silence before the day started, and look at the bills and the bank balance and the job board tabs she'd left open on her laptop the night before, and then she'd make herself put all of it to one side for the hour it took to get Gracie fed and dressed and walk to the corner where she caught the school bus. There was a discipline to it. You didn't let the weight of the whole thing crash down on a 7-year-old eating cereal at 6 in the morning. You put on a particular face, and you made the pancakes, and you told her it was just a regular Tuesday. The afternoons were harder. Gracie came home at 3:15, and by 3:40 she was at the kitchen table with her backpack emptied and her homework spread out, and Teresa would sit across from her doing job applications while Gracie practiced her spelling words. On a good day, there might be 2 or 3 listings worth applying to. On bad days, the boards showed the same postings that had been up for a month, and Teresa would find herself reading the requirements and trying to figure out how to describe 8 years of accurate, diligent work in language that an automated screening system would recognize as sufficient. The rejections came back fast. A form email, usually within 48 hours. Occasionally a personalized rejection that said things like strong candidate pool or considering internal candidates at this time, which meant the same thing. 3 times she made it to a second interview. Twice those calls ended with a polite follow-up email that came 3 weeks later. The 3rd time there was no follow-up at all, just silence that gradually became its own kind of answer. Teresa had been a bookkeeper for 8 years at a mid-sized logistics company in Columbus, good at it, reliable, the kind of employee who still came in with a cold because she felt guilty leaving things unfinished. She knew the company's finances better than most of the people who ran it. She could look at a set of numbers and see the whole story in a few minutes, which was why, looking at her own bank statement in the parking lot of a Walgreens at 4 o'clock on the afternoon she was laid off, she understood immediately and clearly exactly how much time she had before things became impossible. She had known it was coming. The company had brought in a consulting firm in July, the kind that comes in and talks about efficiency and then leaves a month later having recommended automation for about 40% of your workforce. She'd started job applications before the announcement came. She was prepared, or she thought she was. What she was not prepared for was how long it would take. 8 months of sending applications and getting form rejections, of second interviews that went nowhere, of freelance bookkeeping work that paid maybe $400 in a good month and nothing in a bad one. 8 months of watching the savings account drain in increments that grew more alarming the longer she watched, of explaining to Gracie why they were having pasta again, of lying awake at 2 in the morning doing the math she'd already done a dozen times, because maybe she'd made an error somewhere and the numbers would be different. They were never different. Gracie had started first grade that fall and came home most days, carrying worksheets in a backpack decorated with construction paper butterflies she'd made in class. She had her mother's focus and a brightness that broke Teresa's heart a little every time she saw it, because it seemed so insistently cheerful in the face of things Teresa was trying to protect her from noticing. Children noticed everything, of course. Gracie had stopped asking for things she wanted. She no longer asked for new shoes when the old ones got too small. She'd started turning off lights when she left a room. The eviction notice had been coming for 3 weeks. Teresa had known that too, the way you know something you've been refusing to look directly at. The landlord, a man named Gerald Potts who lived in Phoenix and managed the Columbus property through an app on his phone, had sent 2 warning emails and 1 certified letter before resorting to the door. Teresa had ignored all of it the way people ignore the dentist, not because she didn't understand the consequences, but because understanding and being able to do anything about them are entirely different problems. She called her mother that night after Gracie went to bed. The conversation lasted 11 minutes and ended with Linda Calloway saying, in the measured tone she used when she wanted to be kind but couldn't quite manage it, that Teresa had always been too willing to trust things to work out, that she should have moved in with her sister Diane 2 months ago when the offer was on the table. Teresa had not taken that offer because Diane's house had 3 bedrooms. 2 of them were occupied by Diane's children, and the third Diane had described as available but honestly kind of a craft room. Teresa had a 7-year-old daughter and a problem with her pride that she recognized was a luxury she could no longer afford but could not seem to let go of. She could not bring herself to sleep in a craft room and be grateful about it every morning. So she stayed in the Columbus rental, and the 30 days began ticking quietly toward 0. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon, 9 days after the eviction notice, while Teresa was helping Gracie with a reading worksheet at the kitchen table and trying to figure out whether she could stretch a pound of ground turkey across 3 dinners if she added enough rice to one of them. The number had a Montana area code she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Miss Calloway? Teresa Calloway? The voice on the other end was older, male, carrying the deliberate, measured cadence of someone who had spent a long career delivering news people weren't expecting. My name is Martin Holt. I'm an estate attorney in Colder Creek, Montana. I'm calling because you've been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Earl Lyle Stanton. Teresa set down her pencil. Earl Stanton. The name belonged to a face she'd only ever seen in photographs. Her grandmother's younger brother. A man who'd left the family in Ohio sometime in the early 1970s and settled somewhere in Montana, and after that remained at the outer edge of the family's awareness, a name mentioned occasionally at holidays, a card that arrived at Christmas some years and didn't arrive other years. Teresa had met him once, possibly, at a family reunion when she was 4 or 5 years old. She retained no memory of it beyond a photograph her grandmother had kept on the refrigerator for years. A tall, thin man in a plaid shirt standing beside a truck, squinting into the sun with an expression that said he'd rather be somewhere else. Earl Stanton, she said slowly. I didn't know he'd passed. Last month. He was 89. He'd been in declining health for some time. Martin Holt's voice was careful, practiced. He had no children, no spouse. He'd amended his will in 2019 to name you specifically. I've been making inquiries through the family to locate you. Teresa was quiet for a moment. Across the table, Gracie had set down her pencil and was watching her mother with open, unashamed attention. What did he leave me? Another careful pause. A property. A log cabin on approximately 12 acres outside Colder Creek, about 40 miles east of Billings. He'd owned it since 1968. She waited for the rest of it. I want to be straightforward with you, Miss Calloway, because I think you deserve an honest picture before you make any decisions. The property has been assessed by the county at $200. The structure is in significant disrepair. The access road washed out several years ago and was only partially repaired after that. There's no current utility service. The connection was cut off decades ago. Frankly, several other family members have already been in contact with me about this estate. and they've all declined to claim it once they understood what it involved. $200. What does claiming it involve? Teresa asked. You'd need to come to Colder Creek in person to sign the transfer documents. There's a small outstanding property tax balance, roughly $300, that would transfer to you with the estate. Beyond that, the land is clear of any other liens. I should also tell you that the structure has been sealed padlocked, windows boarded since 1981. The county has flagged the land as potentially unstable due to what surveyors believe are underground water formations beneath the property. That's part of why the assessed value is so low. Nobody's been willing to develop it or buy it. He paused. I'm being thorough because some people make this drive and feel it wasn't worth the trip. Teresa looked at Gracie. The little girl was watching her with an expression of total, quiet attention. Mr. Whiskers pressed against her chest. I'll come, Teresa said. She told her mother that same night. Linda Calloway heard the full explanation and was quiet for a moment. A cabin in Montana worth $200. 12 acres of land. 12 acres of what? Mountains? Rocks? Earl Stanton was a strange man, Teresa. He left the family without a word and lived up there alone for 50 years. Whatever he left behind, I wouldn't assume it's something anyone would want. Someone wanted it. He left it to me specifically. You're a stranger to him. He probably just drew a name out of the family tree. Her mother's voice softened slightly. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to save you money you don't have. Teresa didn't answer that. There wasn't much to say to it. She called Diane next. Please don't do this, Diane said, after Teresa ran through it. This is exactly like the Facebook Marketplace car situation. The engine didn't fall out. It overheated on the highway, and you were stranded for 4 hours with a 3-year-old. Gracie's 7 now. Teresa, Diane took a breath. You have $37 and an eviction notice. What you need is to come stay with me so we can figure out your next step. Not to drive to Montana for a condemned cabin. It's not condemned. It's assessed low. There's a difference? Yes, a meaningful one. Diane was quiet for a moment. I'll have the craft room ready when you get back. 2 days later, Teresa put what fit in her car, loaded the rest of their things into a storage unit she was paying for on a credit card that was nearly at its limit, and drove out of Columbus on a gray Thursday morning with Gracie asleep in the back seat and Mr. Whiskers propped against the window and 1,100 miles of highway ahead of them. She'd dipped into the emergency fund she'd been telling herself for 3 months she wouldn't touch. Gas, one night at a motel in South Dakota, fast food twice. She did the math and stopped doing the math. Gracie was a good traveler. She slept for long stretches and woke and watched the landscape move outside the window with the steady, unsentimental curiosity of children observing things they don't yet have words for. When the flat Ohio farmland gave way to the wide roll of the plains and then, a day later, to the first blue rise of the Rockies on the horizon, Gracie pressed her face against the glass and went very still. It looks like a screensaver, she said. Teresa laughed, the first real laugh in several days. It really does. Is our cabin in the mountains? Near them. The foothills. Gracie considered this arrangement. Does it have a bathtub? Honestly, I don't know. What does it have? We're going to find out together. Gracie appeared satisfied with this, or at least willing to accept it as a reasonable answer, and went back to watching the mountains come closer. They stopped that night at a motel in Billings and ate dinner at a diner across the street. Grilled cheese for Gracie, soup for Teresa, coffee that came in a thick ceramic mug and tasted like it had been sitting since noon. Teresa spread the county map Martin Holt had emailed her across the table and traced the route with her finger, while Gracie methodically separated her grilled cheese into individual cheese strings and ate them one by one. Mr. Whiskers thinks we should live there, Gracie said. In the cabin? He says it might be an adventure. Teresa folded the map. Mr. Whiskers might be right. They drove the rest of the way the next morning. Somewhere in the long stretch of highway between Billings and the turnoff for Colder Creek, Gracie fell asleep again, her head tipped against the window, Mr. Whiskers tucked under her chin. Teresa drove without music, watching the landscape open up around her, the brown grass rolling to the horizon in every direction, the sky enormous and pale, the mountains ahead growing taller and more specific with every mile. She'd grown up in Ohio, and she'd never been west of Indiana before this week. The scale of it was something she hadn't been prepared for. The way the land just kept going. The the way there was so much of it with so few marks of human effort on it. She thought about Earl Stanton, who had left Ohio in 1972 or thereabouts and driven to Montana and found a piece of that land and built a cabin on it and lived there. She thought about what it would take to do that, to simply leave the life you'd been given and make one somewhere else from nothing. She thought about the fact that she was now doing something similar, though not exactly by choice, and that there was perhaps a line connecting them across the decades whether Earl had known it or not. She'll understand what to do with it. She still didn't know what that meant, but she was moving toward it, which was more than she could say for most of the last 8 months. They reached Colder Creek on a Friday afternoon in early November. It was the kind of small town that exists in full and is completely over before you've registered that you've entered it. A main street with a hardware store, a diner called the Valley Spot, a post office, a gas station, a church with a marquee sign that read "God is still speaking, please listen," and below that, in smaller letters, a reminder about the chili dinner on Saturday. The mountains stood enormous and white above the tree line at the edge of everything, close enough to feel like they were leaning in over the rooftops. Martin Holt's office was above the hardware store, reached by a narrow staircase with an uneven railing that wobbled slightly under Teresa's hand. The attorney who answered the door was in his late 60s, gray-haired, wearing a button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had the look of a man who had spent 30 years handling property disputes and probate matters in a small town and had arrived, by long familiarity, at a kind of calm acceptance of human complexity. He shook Teresa's hand, then crouched slightly to shake Gracie's hand with exactly the same seriousness, which Gracie accepted without comment. His office smelled like old paper and wood varnish. There was a photograph of a mountain on one wall and a shelf of legal binders on another, and a window looking out over the main street, where you could see the mountains from every angle no matter where you stood. "I appreciate you making the trip," Martin said, settling behind his desk. "I didn't have a lot of other options," Teresa said, which came out more honest than she'd planned. He gave her a brief, assessing look that wasn't unkind. He opened a manila folder and laid several documents across the desk. "These are the transfer papers. The property tax balance is $287. Once that's settled, the deed transfers to you free and clear." He slid a photograph across the desk. Color, slightly faded, the edges sharp in the way of early 1980s photography. A log cabin in a clearing backed by pine-covered hills. Modest but solid, the logs darkened by weather, a steep roof built for snow. A covered porch ran the full length of the front. Firewood stacked neatly along one side. A clearing that had been kept, grass cut, nothing overgrown. "Taken around 1981, Martin said. "The last time I have any record of the property being actively used. Earl visited briefly in 2019, according to the tax records, but by all accounts he didn't stay long. The structure's been padlocked since he left and 81 windows boarded from the inside." "Why did he leave?" Teresa asked. "Nobody knows. He paid the taxes every year without fail until his death. 60 years of property tax payments on a place he walked away from. Whatever his reasons were, he kept them to himself." Martin Holt folded his hands on the desk. "I should tell you something about the 2019 visit. A local man named Roy Griggs, who runs a fence repair business out here, mentioned to me that he'd seen lights at the property that spring a truck parked on the access road for 2 nights. This was confirmed by the tax records as the year Earl traveled to Montana. Nobody knows what he did there. He didn't speak to anyone in town that I've been able to determine." Teresa looked at the photograph. The cabin in the photo had a quality she couldn't immediately name, something about the way it sat in the clearing, the specificity of the stacked firewood, the proportions of the porch. It didn't look like a vacation property. It looked like a home where someone had meant to stay. "He amended his will in 2019, she said. "The same year he came back." "That's correct. He came back, did something, then drove home and changed his will to leave it to me." Martin Holt was quiet for a moment. "That is the sequence of events, yes." Teresa looked at him. "Did you know him?" "I never met him personally. He handled his legal affairs through a firm in Billings. The file was transferred to me when that attorney retired." He paused. "What I can tell you is that the amendment to his will was very specific. It didn't just leave the property to you generically as the next of kin. It named you by full name, by your Columbus address at the time, and included a handwritten note not legally binding, just attached to the document that said, in its entirety, she'll understand what to do with it. The room was quiet for a moment. Even Gracie had stopped fidgeting in her chair. He didn't know me, Teresa said. No, by all accounts he didn't. She looked at the photograph again for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen. She signed the transfer papers, wrote a check for $287 from the account she'd been protecting since the drive from Columbus, and walked out of Martin Holt's office with the deed to 12 acres of Montana land and a single brass key on a plain ring, old and tarnished, its teeth worn smooth from years sitting in a drawer. Gracie held the key in the elevator down and turned it over in her fingers, studying it the way she studied everything she considered important. It's very old, she said. Older than me, Teresa said. Older than Grandma? Probably. Gracie handed it back carefully. We should be gentle with it. They drove out to the property late that afternoon, the November light already going gold and flat as the sun dropped toward the mountains. The county road turned to gravel 4 miles out, exactly as Martin had said, and the gravel grew narrower and more uncertain until it became barely 2 tire tracks through a tunnel of pine trees that crowded both shoulders. Teresa's car scraped the road on a couple of low spots, but made it through without trouble. The cabin appeared through the trees without much warning. One moment there was forest, and then there was a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing was the cabin from the photograph, 43 years older, surrounded by grass gone ragged and knee-high, the covered porch sagging at the east end, where one support post had rotted and settled. The logs of the exterior had weathered from dark brown to a deep silvery gray. One of the boarded windows had taken on a lean. The roof appeared intact, steep and unbroken, the metal chimney pipe rising from the back corner showing a stripe of old rust, but no visible collapse. The trees had crept closer since the photograph. Pine branches extended overhead, reaching for the structure from both sides like something slow and patient. Teresa parked and sat for a moment with the engine running. Is this it? Gracie asked from the back. This is it. Gracie studied it through the windshield, chin propped on the back of Teresa's seat. It's very old, she said. She had apparently settled on this as the appropriate phrase for the day. It is. Is it safe? We're going to check. They got out. The air smelled like pine resin and cold earth, and something else underneath, something mineral and faintly sweet that Teresa couldn't place. The grass crunched underfoot, already touched by frost that hadn't fully lifted from the shaded edges of the clearing. A woodpecker was working somewhere in the tree-line. Nothing else moved. The clearing held a silence that wasn't empty exactly, more like something held its breath. She walked to the porch steps and tested the first one. It held. The second held. The third gave a long warning groan, but didn't give way. She walked carefully along the porch boards, testing each with her weight before committing to it, checking for rot beneath the overhang. The door was padlocked with a heavy hasp lock, the kind used on barns and storage units, solid and industrial and thoroughly at odds with the simple wooden door it secured. The brass key fit. It resisted at first, the tumblers seized from decades of cold and damp, and she worked it slowly with both hands until something released. The lock opened with a sound like pressure escaping, and she stood with her hand on the door for a moment before pushing it open. 43 years. 43 years since any air had moved through this room, since any eyes had seen what was inside. Whatever Earl Stanton had walked away from in 1981, it had been sitting undisturbed through everything since, through all the years of the world turning, the seasons coming and going above this roof, the trees growing closer. She pushed the door open. The smell that came out was thick and closed old wood, dried dust, the faint sweetness of things kept cold and still for a very long time. Teresa switched on her phone flashlight and stepped inside. The main room was larger than the exterior suggested. A stone fireplace occupied most of the north wall, the hearth still holding the remains of a long-dead fire ash and charred wood that had not been touched since the last time Earl Stanton lit it. A wood stove stood in the southwest corner, cast iron, its surface dull with the particular flatness of metal that has sat in one place long enough to become part of the floor. Along the east wall, a narrow bed frame, no mattress. A wooden table, 2 ladder-back chairs. A set of rough shelves holding mason jars, most of them empty, one holding the dark, unidentifiable remains of something that had once been preserves. A coat rack beside the door with a canvas jacket hanging from it, and a pair of work gloves on the hook below, fingers still spread as if waiting for hands. A kerosene lantern on the table, bone dry. It was a room where someone had expected to come back in a day or two and never did. Gracie stood in the doorway behind her, taking it all in without speaking. The way she did with things she understood were serious. "He left all his stuff," she said softly. "He did. Why would you leave your coat?" Teresa moved the flashlight slowly across the walls, the ceiling, the floor. "I don't know. Maybe he got scared," Gracie said. She said it simply, without drama. "What makes you think that?" Gracie shrugged. "It feels like when we left our apartment. Like when you packed the car at night." Teresa looked at her for a moment, then back at the room. The coat on the hook. The gloves. A man who had paid 60 years of property taxes on a place he'd fled in the middle of his life. She moved the light slowly across the floor. The planks were wide and dense, old growth, the kind of wood that doesn't show up in lumberyards anymore. They told the accumulated record of a life worn paths between the door and the fireplace, dark patches near the stove, the shallow scratches of furniture moved and moved again over years. But in the center of the room, perhaps 6 feet from the fireplace, there was a section of flooring that sat differently. She crouched and brought the light close. The planks in that area were a slightly different tone, lighter in color, with a smoother surface. Standing up you'd never catch it, but at low angle, with a light, the difference was clear. 8 feet square, approximately. And at the seam where these boards met the original floor, a gap. Thin as a knife blade, running clean and continuous on all 4 sides. This section had been added, replaced, or installed after the rest of the floor was laid. She ran her fingers along the seam. The boards didn't move, but the gap was there, and it was deliberate. "Mama, what are you looking at?" Gracie asked. "Some of these boards are different." Teresa sat back on her heels, newer than the rest. Gracie came to crouch beside her, following the flashlight beam with her eyes. She put her small palm flat on the lighter boards and considered them with the focused attention she gave things she decided mattered. Then she got bored with it and went to look at the coat on the rack. Teresa stayed crouched for a long moment, her mind working through what she was looking at. Earl Stanton had left this cabin in 1981. He had come back once, in the spring of 2019, at 84 years old, and done something in those 2 nights before driving away. He had then gone home, amended his will to name a great niece he'd never known, attached a note that said she'll understand what to do with it, and died 5 years later. She photographed the section of flooring with her phone. She photographed the seam. She photographed the fireplace, the walls, every surface. Outside, the light was nearly gone. The pines around the clearing had turned black against the last orange strip of sky. It was colder now, a cold with teeth, the clearing holding it in the way open ground does after dark. "We need to go find a motel," Teresa said. "We'll come back tomorrow with supplies." That night at the Ridgeback, in 12 rooms, a humming vending machine in the hallway, a television with 6 channels, bedspreads in a brown floral pattern that probably had not changed since the Reagan administration. Teresa sat on the edge of the bed after Gracie fell asleep and scrolled through the photographs she'd taken, zooming in on the floor seam, running her thumb across the screen. The section of replaced flooring was 8 feet square. She kept returning to that measurement. Not a small repair, not a quick patch over a rotted spot. 8 feet square was deliberate. It was the footprint of something large enough to matter. She pulled up what she could find about Earl Stanton on her phone. It wasn't much. No social media. Obviously, he'd been 89 years old and a recluse. A property tax record for the Colder Creek land. An old brief mention in a 1968 Billings newspaper real estate filing. The kind of routine notice printed when land changed hands. A death notice from a Billings paper the previous month, 3 sentences long. Earl Lyle Stanton, 89, of Billings, Montana. No survivors listed. Private services held. Private services. She thought about that. An entire life that ended in 3 sentences, no ceremony, no people named. She didn't know whether to feel sad about that or to understand it as a deliberate choice. Maybe both. She pulled up her bank account, looked at the balance, set her phone face down on the bedspread, and sat in the dark for a moment. Then she picked it up again and went back to the photograph of the floor. She called her mother. She said the cabin was in rough shape, but structurally sound. She did not mention the floor. "And your actual plan?" her mother asked. "Get utilities connected. Fix it up. It's a solid structure." "In Montana. In November. With what money?" "With what I have." Her mother made a sound that was not agreement and not quite disagreement. Your sister said the craft room is still, I know. Teresa softened her voice. I know, Mom. I'll be okay. After she hung up, she lay in the dark for a long time, watching shadows from the vending machine light move across the ceiling. She thought about Earl Stanton's note. She'll understand what to do with it. He had not written she'll know what it is. He had written she'll understand what to do with it. The distinction felt important, and she couldn't have explained why. She thought about the 2019 visit. An 84-year-old man driving a truck to a property he'd abandoned 4 decades before, spending 2 nights there, leaving again without speaking to anyone in town, driving home and changing his will. She thought about the replaced section of flooring, about the thin clean seam running all the way around it. She fell asleep with her phone on the pillow, the photographs still open. They drove back to the cabin the next morning with flashlights from the hardware store on Main Street, a bag of groceries, a toolbox Teresa had put on the credit card, and a pry bar she'd added at the last minute and told herself was for general maintenance. She'd also picked up 2 extension cords and a small work light. She could run off the car battery through the cigarette port if the day's work required more light than the windows provided. The drive out felt shorter in daylight. The mountains were visible now, white above the tree line against a clear blue sky, and the November light came through the pines at a low angle that made everything look clean and specific. When they came through the trees into the clearing, the cabin sat in the morning light looking less grim than it had the previous evening, more simply old, weathered and worn but not defeated. Gracie jumped out and immediately went to stand in the tall grass and look up at the mountains. Can you see them from inside? The windows are boarded. We'll take some boards down today. All of them. As many as we can. The day's work was physical and slow. Teresa started on the porch, replacing the boards that had gone soft beneath the overhang and stacking the ruined wood to one side. She used a hammer to pull nails from the window boards, beginning on the east-facing windows where the morning light would come in first. Gracie held the boards as she worked, which was more effort than help most of the time, but felt necessary to both of them. By noon, 4 of the 6 windows were uncovered, and the main room was transformed. Light flooded in from 3 angles, and the space stopped feeling sealed and started feeling like a room again, dusty and stripped down, but full of the particular quality that old wood has when sun hits it, something warm and alive that it retains even after everything else has gone cold. Teresa opened the front door and the rear window at the same time to get air moving, and the accumulated smell of 4 decades of sealed space began, slowly, to clear. They ate lunch on the porch step, sandwiches from the grocery bag, apples, water from bottles. Gracie insisted on carrying herself in her small backpack. A hawk was working thermals above the clearing, tilting and banking without appearing to move its wings at all. It's not that bad, Gracie said. She said it in the way children sometimes say things that are about more than what's visible, an acknowledgement, a small piece being made with something. No, Teresa said. It's actually kind of beautiful. Gracie looked up at the mountains. Mr. Whiskers likes it. Good. Then we stay. After lunch, Teresa turned to the cabin's practical needs with the focus she'd been trained into by 8 years of bookkeeping, systematic, thorough, one task at a time. She cleared the fireplace ash with a short-handled shovel she found in the woodshed behind the cabin, working carefully in case the chimney wasn't sound. She swept the floors, raising slow golden clouds of dust that drifted through the new light. She wiped down the shelves, moved the table, examined the woodstove's connections, and found them surprisingly intact. The coat was still on the rack. She looked at it once and left it where it was. The woodshed behind the cabin held more than a shovel. There was an axe with a cracked handle, a handsaw, a coil of rope that had gone stiff, and, hung on nails along the back wall, a row of tools that someone had arranged with the kind of care you give things you expect to use again. Chisels, a wooden mallet, a small hand plane, a set of files. The tools of a man who worked with his hands, who built things, who knew how to make the physical world do what he needed it to do. She stood in the shed for a moment, looking at them. Then she went back to the cabin. In the main room, she found more than she'd expected the first night. Behind the wood stove, a tin box holding a collection of hardware screws, bolts, hinges, the accumulated fasteners of years of maintenance and repair. Inside the storage room at the back, a crate of old mason jars still sealed with rubber rings, the contents long gone to nothing but the glass itself intact. Beneath the bed frame, tucked against the wall, a flat wooden box she had to reach for with her arm fully extended. She pulled it out and brushed the dust away. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone brittle at the corners, were two things: a set of hand-drawn plans, rolled and secured with a piece of thin wire, and a small notebook with a plain cardboard cover. She unrolled the plans carefully. They were drawn in pencil on thick paper, the lines precise, and measured the work of someone who understood technical drafting. The drawings showed a foundation, measurements in feet and inches, a series of views from different angles. She opened the notebook. The pages were yellowed but intact. The handwriting was small and precise, the kind of handwriting that comes from someone who learned to write carefully and never stopped. Most of the entries were short measurements, material lists, the kind of field notes a builder keeps while a project is underway. Dates running from early 1978 through the fall of 1980. The last entry was dated October 14, 1980. Perimeter sealed and confirmed. Electrical on long-hold battery. Estimated 60-plus year life. Code set. Access confirmed. Notation: should last. Should last. Teresa read it twice. Then she turned to the back of the notebook. On the inside back cover, written in the same small hand, was a single line. If you're reading this, you found it. Good. She sat with the notebook in her lap for a long moment, the autumn light coming through the uncovered windows and the dust still settling around her. From outside, she could hear Gracie talking to Mr. Whiskers in a low, carrying voice about the specific shapes of clouds. Earl Stanton had built something in 1978, 1979, 1980. He had sealed it and confirmed it, and set a code and estimated the battery life at 60 years. He had left instructions in the form of a note on a wall and a notebook under a bed frame and a door in the floor still running on a battery he'd put in 43 years ago. The battery had held. She stood up and walked to the section of replaced flooring. She worked around the section of replaced flooring, always aware of it. Her eye kept returning to it as she moved through the room, the way your tongue returns to a loose tooth. In the full afternoon light, it was slightly more obvious the lighter tone of those boards sitting differently against their surroundings. The work had been done well. The edges were tight, and the nails countersunk. Someone who knew what they were doing. At mid-afternoon, Teresa sent Gracie outside to play in the clearing. Stay where I can see you from the window. She retrieved the pry bar from the toolbox. She crouched over the replaced section and felt a moment's hesitation, not about her right to do it. She had that now, signed and filed, but something else. The sense of disturbing something that had been deliberately kept. But Earl Stanton had made this hers. He had made this very specifically hers and attached a note saying she would know what to do. If there was something here, he had intended for her to find it. She slid the pry bar into the seam between the replaced boards and the original floor. The first plank resisted, then gave way with a low crack of old nails. She set it aside and tried the second. It came up more easily. Below the planks was not the subfloor she expected. There was a gap several inches of darkness, and then a surface below. She could see the edge of it in the flashlight beam, smooth and flat and made of metal. She pulled up a third plank. The metal surface was revealed across several square feet now. It was steel, thick and seamless, brushed with the particular flatness of industrial-grade construction. It descended from where the planks met it at a precise right angle. Not part of the cabin's original structure. Not a natural feature of the land. Built with intention and precision, sunk into the earth below the floor of Earl Stanton's cabin. A room. There was a room below the floor. Teresa sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. Outside, she could hear Gracie talking to Mr. Whiskers in the grass, some ongoing conversation about the mountains and what different cloud shapes were called. She was still crouching there, her hands on the edges of the removed planks, when she heard the back door creak and Gracie's footsteps on the swept floor. "Mama!" Teresa looked up. Gracie had come in from the clearing and was standing in the middle of the room. She wasn't looking at her mother. She was looking at the floor, at the removed planks, at the darkness below. Her expression was very focused, the one she made when she was seeing something specific and trying to make sense of it. "There's light coming from underground," Gracie said. Teresa frowned. "What? Down there?" Gracie crossed the room carefully and crouched at the edge of the exposed section, pointing into the gap. "See it?" Teresa moved closer and killed her flashlight. The room went dim, and there it was. A thread of green light, barely brighter than nothing, rising from somewhere in the darkness below the metal surface. It came through what appeared to be a seam or a narrow vent in the steel. The light was steady and faint, the precise color of an indicator lamp on a piece of old industrial equipment. Not flickering, not fading, steady. Something below was powered. Something below had been running, quietly, for a very long time. In a cabin sealed since 1981 with no utility connection, 40 miles outside a small Montana town, something below the floor was lit green. Teresa stared at it. The cold coming up from the gap was real and constant. The light pulsed once, very slightly, then held. Gracie had her chin in her hands, watching it with the patient, settled attention she gave everything she decided was worth watching. "What is it?" she asked. Teresa's voice came out quieter than she intended. "I don't know," she said. She pulled up another plank. Then another. The full expanse of the metal surface came into view, a heavy steel panel, approximately 8 feet square, bolted to a frame set into the ground below the cabin floor. The green light was clearly visible now, emanating from a small rectangular indicator window set flush into the steel. Beside it, a panel recessed into the surface, covered by a thin layer of protective housing that had cracked slightly with age but remained in place. Beneath the housing, a numeric keypad, 10 digits, plus a confirm key. And below the keypad, set deep into the steel with a rubber-wrapped handle that had aged and cracked but was otherwise intact, a recessed door handle. She leaned in closer. The steel was clean. 43 years underground, sealed under a wood floor, and there was no rust on the surface of this door, no corrosion at the seams, no evidence of water intrusion. Whoever had built this had built it to last. Industrial-grade waterproofing, she guessed, though she was not an engineer. Just someone who had spent a career reading the records of what things cost and what they were worth, and who understood that the level of construction she was looking at had not come cheap. This was not the work of a man who had put his savings into a hole in the ground and hoped for the best. This was precision work. This was someone who had known exactly what they were doing. A door. A locked door set into the earth below Earl Stanton's cabin, with a keypad that still had power. A door that had been waiting, sealed, and running for 43 years. Teresa sat on the bare floor of the cabin with the green light rising steadily from below and her daughter beside her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not quite hope, or not only hope. Something steadier than hope. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a question you've been afraid to ask. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the cold steel door. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The mountains caught the late light. The cabin sat in its clearing the same way it had always sat, patient, keeping it secret, waiting for someone to come with the right key. Teresa looked at the keypad. 10 digits. A combination chosen by a man who had driven up here alone in the spring of 2019 at the age of 84 and done something before driving away and amending his will. He had left a note. She'll understand what to do with it. She did not yet understand, but she was beginning to believe she would. She needed tools she didn't have yet, and answers she hadn't found. She needed to understand what Earl Stanton had built under this floor, and why he'd built it, and what he had expected when he set his affairs in order and aimed everything at a woman in Columbus, Ohio, who was nearly out of money and completely out of options. She thought about the notebook. Should last. If you're reading this, you found it. Good. He'd written that knowing he would never be here to see it. He'd written it for whoever came after him. Whoever followed the chain he'd set in motion from Ohio all the way to this clearing in the Montana foothills. He'd planned for this moment with the same precision he'd used to plan everything else: the waterproof door, the long-life battery, the numbers scratched into the wall, the will amended to the right name. She'll understand what to do with it. Whatever was below that door, Earl Stanton had decided it belonged to her. But before any of that, she needed to understand one other thing. She pulled out her phone and opened the photographs from the day before. She scrolled through them slowly: the fireplace, the shelves, the coat rack, the table. She stopped at a photograph of the wall beside the rear door. In the image, taken in the dim light of the first afternoon, there was something she'd registered at the time and then let slide past because you do that, you notice and move on, and your brain files it away. A shape on the wall. Not decoration. Not damage. The kind of thing left by someone who needed to be subtle about it. She walked to the wall beside the rear door with the flashlight held at a low angle, raking light across the surface the way you do when you're looking for something you almost saw. It was there, scratched into the log with something sharp and narrow, a nail or a blade at a height that would have been comfortable for a standing man. 6 numbers, in a single careful line. The scratches were shallow but cleanly made. Not hurried. Deliberate. A combination. Teresa wrote them down on her phone with shaking hands. She walked back to the door in the floor and crouched beside it. The green light was steady. The keypad waited. Gracie pressed close beside her, warm and small and completely certain, in the way of 7-year-olds who have not yet learned to doubt the next moment, that whatever happened next would be something worth seeing. Teresa looked at the numbers on her phone. She looked at the keypad. She looked at the thread of green light. She entered the first number, then the second, then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, from somewhere deep below the floor of Earl Stanton's sealed and forgotten cabin, something moved. The sound was low and hydraulic, a slow exhale of pressurized air releasing from a seal that had held for over 40 years. The keypad's green light shifted to white. The door did not swing open. It rose, inch by slow inch. The entire steel panel lifted on a hidden mechanism, tilting back like the lid of something enormous and patient, and a column of cool air rose from below and touched Teresa's face. It smelled like metal and stone and something older than either. Not damp, not rotting, preserved, the way a sealed room preserves itself unchanged from the moment it was closed. Every molecule of air exactly where it had been left. A set of concrete steps led down into the darkness, each one cut precisely into the earth, their edges clean and sharp. The walls on either side were poured concrete, smooth and uncracked. The long-life LED strip that Earl Stanton had installed along the ceiling, a pale amber now, most of its strength spent, but still present, illuminated a space that was larger than Teresa had expected. She sat at the edge for a moment and looked down. "I'm going first," she said. "You stay right here." Gracie had moved to a safe distance from the opening at Teresa's instruction, sitting cross-legged on the swept floor with Mr. Whiskers on her knee. She watched with the absolute stillness she could produce when she decided something was important enough to warrant it. "How far down?" she asked. "I'm about to find out." Teresa tested the first step with her full weight. It held without flex or sound. She descended slowly, one hand against the concrete wall, the phone flashlight pointed ahead of her. The steps went down 12 feet, then turned 90 degrees and opened into the main space. She stopped on the last step and looked. The room was approximately 30 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with an 8-foot ceiling of poured concrete. The walls were lined with industrial metal shelving units, the kind used in commercial storage, bolted directly into the concrete. The shelving was double-sided, running the full length of both long walls, with a walkway down the center. The amber LED strip ran the perimeter of the ceiling in an unbroken line, giving the room the quality of something preserved in low light, the way museum storage rooms look when the lights are kept dim to protect what's inside. On the shelves were crates. Wooden crates, sealed with fitted lids, stacked 2 and 3 high. Dozens of them, each one approximately the size of a produce box, each labeled on the end with a hand-stenciled code in black paint letters and numbers Teresa didn't immediately recognize. The crates showed no rot, no mold, no deterioration. The cold and the sealed concrete had done their work. In the far right corner of the room, there was a separate area, a low metal table with a chair, a filing cabinet, and above both, a wall-mounted panel with a set of switches and gauges that Teresa recognized as some kind of environmental monitoring system. Humidity control, temperature regulation. Earl Stanton had not dug a hole and pushed things into it. He had built a climate-controlled vault. She turned slowly in the center of the room, the flashlight moving across the crates. Then she crossed to the nearest shelving unit, took hold of the closest crate, and pulled. It did not slide easily. It took both hands and the kind of effort that tells you immediately you're dealing with significant weight. She pulled it to the edge of the shelf and set it down on the floor with a heavy, final sound that reverberated off the concrete walls. The lid had a simple catch-a-metal pin through a hasp, nothing more. She pulled the pin and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry straw packing that had compressed over the years to a flat layer, were ingots. A dozen of them, side by side, each one approximately the size of a thick paperback novel, each one the same deep, unmistakable yellow of a color that exists almost nowhere else in the natural world. Gold. Bar gold, solid and dense, each one stamped on the top face with a mark she leaned in to read. A small eagle above the letters M, a O, followed by a number and a weight. Below the eagle, a date. 1897, Montana Assay Office. 1897. These bars had been cast 127 years ago. Teresa sat back on her heels. She picked up one bar with both hands. It weighed roughly 25 pounds, and the effort required for that weight was startling. The way pure density always surprises you the first time you encounter it. The surface was slightly rough from the casting process, the edges clean and precise, the stamp perfectly readable despite more than a century of existence. She set it down carefully, opened the crate beside it. More bars. The same markings, the same dates. A few bore different assay dates: 1903, 1908, 1912, but all from the same office, all showing the same eagle mark, all the same deep, serious yellow. She opened a third crate. A fourth. She lost count of how many she opened in the next 20 minutes, moving along the shelving unit while the amber light held steady overhead and the cold air of the vault pressed against her skin. Every crate held bars. Every bar held the unmistakable weight of something real. "Mama." Gracie's voice came from the top of the stairs. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay." Teresa's own voice sounded strange to her, compressed and flat in the concrete space. "I'm okay. Don't come down yet." She walked to the far end of the room and stood there looking back at the shelving units. 63 crates on the right-hand wall, 57 on the left. She counted twice to be sure. 120 crates, each holding 12 bars. She was estimating the weight of each bar at around 25 pounds. She did the math in her head, then did it again, then took out her phone and put the numbers into the calculator because she did not trust her head with this. The calculator gave her a number she read 3 times. At the current spot price of gold, the bars in this room represented a figure north of $400 million. Teresa leaned against the concrete wall and stayed there for a long time without moving. The amber light hummed. The temperature held at a precise 52 degrees. Outside, above 12 feet of earth and a layer of concrete, and a floor and a clearing and 43 years of Montana sky, her 7-year-old daughter was sitting on a swept wooden floor holding a stuffed rabbit and waiting to hear what her mother had found. She straightened up. She went to the filing cabinet. It was a 4-drawer steel cabinet, the old kind built in the 1970s or 1980s, heavy and square-cornered. The drawers were unlocked. The first drawer held folders, dozens of them, their tabs hand-labeled in the same precise, small handwriting she'd seen in the notebook upstairs. She pulled the first folder. Inside was a letter, handwritten, in ink, on paper that had gone soft and cream-colored with age but remained fully legible. The date at the top was June 14th, 1921. The handwriting was different from Earl's larger, with a slight tremor in it, the writing of an older man. It began, "To whoever holds this after me, which I pray is blood." Teresa sat down in the single chair beside the table and began to read. The man who had written the letter was named Silas Reeve Stanton. He had come to Montana from Pennsylvania in 1882, 24 years old, with $40 and a belief that the mining territories represented the last honest opportunity in America for a man of modest means. He was not wrong, at least not immediately. He found work first as a laborer in an established placer operation in the hills east of what would later become Colder Creek, and within 2 years he had saved enough to stake his own claim on a stretch of creek-fed land that other prospectors had passed over as unpromising. The creek gave him very little. The ground below it gave him everything. Silas had found a hard rock vein, deep and running northwest, that bore gold in concentrations he had never heard of in a placer operation. He was careful about it, more careful than most men in his position would have been. He did not announce the find. He did not register an expanded claim immediately. He hired 2 men he trusted absolutely, his cousin and a man named Andrew Foss who had worked beside him since the placer days, and they mined quietly for 3 years before anyone else understood what was happening on Silas Stanton's land. The men he hired were not the problem. Andrew Foss, in particular, was a man Silas described with evident admiration across several letters: steady, discreet, and possessed of the kind of loyalty you couldn't pay for but sometimes earned. They mined quietly for 3 years, using hand tools rather than the industrial equipment that would have drawn attention, extracting carefully and casting bars at the Montana SA office in batches small enough to avoid attracting notice. Silas kept no records that could be found. He paid his taxes on time. He was, by all appearances, a moderately successful small-scale miner on a modest claim. By the time the Eastern investors arrived, and they arrived, as they always did, once the word got out, Silas had already pulled the equivalent of 11,000 ounces of gold from the earth. At the prices of the time, it was not yet a fortune. In the prices of what it would become, it was, by Teresa's rough calculation as she read, something in the range of $20,001,921, or well north of $400 million today. The investors came with lawyers. The lawyers came with documents. The documents argued that Silas Stanton had improperly staked his expanded claim that the mineral rights to the deeper vein had reverted under a territorial grant that predated his surface claim, and that a company called Cascade Mining Corporation, incorporated in New York in 1905, held the legal authority to those mineral rights. What Silas's letters described across the following 16 years was a grinding, incremental dispossession. Cascade's attorneys were well-funded and well-connected. They filed motion after motion, each one requiring Silas to respond at his own expense, each one delaying proceedings while Cascade quietly consolidated its position in the region. Silas described attending court hearings in Helena and watching the judge, a man named Aldrich, exchange private conversations with Cascade's lead counsel before proceedings. He described documents disappearing from the court clerk's office. He described 2 witnesses he had secured to testify on his behalf who withdrew without explanation in the week before the final hearing. He described all of this not with bitterness, though bitterness was clearly present beneath the surface of his careful handwriting, but with the precise forensic attention of a man building a record. He understood by 1916, he wrote, that he was not going to win the legal case. The question had become how to preserve what he could for the people who came after him. The answer was the bars. Bar by bar, year by year, the gold that came out of his vein went into the cellar below his homestead rather than into any account or register that a court could reach. In 1921, Silas Stanton lost. The court awarded the mineral rights retroactively to Cascade Mining. Silas was assessed damages for unauthorized extraction. He was left with the surface acreage and nothing else, except for what he had been putting away since 1905, the bars in the cellar, the record in the letters, and the absolute certainty, which he stated plainly in the final pages of his account, that what had been done to him was a crime committed with the assistance of people who were supposed to prevent exactly that kind of crime. He was not wrong. Teresa had read enough now to know he was not wrong. But being not wrong and being able to do anything about it were, in 1921 Montana, entirely different things. Teresa turned to the next letter. This one was dated 1958. Earl's father, Thomas Stanton, writing to Earl. The original homestead had burned in 1935. Thomas had relocated the gold during the Depression years to a rented commercial storage facility in Billings under a false company name, paying annually for the space with cash. The letter instructed Earl on where the storage unit was, what name it was registered under, and what to do next. At the bottom, a single line. Your grandfather spent his life building this. Don't let it go back to the people who stole from him. The third folder held the court documents from 1921. The fourth held a surveyor's report from 1978, commissioned privately by Earl and mapping the geology of his Calder Creek property, specifically the substrate. A note in Earl's handwriting in the margin read, bedrock at 14 feet, suitable for permanent structure. The year after that survey, he had started building. Teresa closed the filing cabinet and sat for a moment in the amber-lit silence. Earl Stanton had been the keeper of a secret that his grandfather had started keeping in 1905. He had built this vault to protect gold that a court had legally stripped from his family through a process Silas believed was fraudulent and corrupt. He had paid taxes on this land for 60 years to keep it in the family. He had come back at 84, alone, to confirm everything was still there. And then he had gone home and pointed his will at a woman he'd never met, the only remaining blood relative he'd been able to locate who hadn't immediately dismissed the property as worthless. She'll understand what to do with it. Teresa stood up and walked back to the stairs. Gracie, she called. A pause from above. Yes. You can come down. Carefully. One step at a time. The sound of small feet on the concrete steps, one at a time, exactly as instructed. Gracie appeared at the base of the stairs and stopped, her eyes going wide and then wider as she took in the room, the shelving, the crates, the amber light. Is it treasure? She asked. Her voice was very quiet. Yes, Teresa said. Gracie stood still for a moment, looking around with the full attention she gave serious things. Then she looked at her mother. Real treasure? Like actually real? Actually real. Gracie walked to the nearest open crate and looked in at the gold bars without touching them. She studied them for a long moment, her hands clasped behind her back the way she stood when she was looking at things in a museum that had signs saying not to touch. They're beautiful, she said. They are. How much are they worth? Teresa had been asking herself that question in more layers than one since she'd sat down with the calculator. The numerical answer and the real answer were not exactly the same thing. A lot, she said. More than we can really picture right now. Gracie seemed to accept this. She turned in a slow circle, looking at every shelf. What do we do with it? And there it was again. The question Earl Stanton had apparently believed Teresa would know how to answer. We figure out who it really belongs to, Teresa said. And we make sure it goes to the right place. Gracie nodded, as if this were the obvious and only answer. Like returning a lost puppy. Teresa looked at her daughter. Exactly like that. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. They spent the rest of that afternoon in the vault, working carefully and methodically. Teresa took photographs of everything, every shelf, every crate, every document. She photographed the environmental system on the far wall, the LED strips, the door mechanism, the concrete construction, the stenciled codes on the crate ends. She filled her phone's storage and transferred photographs to her laptop in the car and came back for more. Gracie sat on the bottom step and served as her mother's assistant, holding the flashlight where Teresa pointed and handing things back with the gravity of someone performing an important duty. Between crates, Teresa tried to explain to Gracie, as simply and accurately as she could, what they were looking at and why it mattered. She told her about Silas Stanton, who had come to Montana when the mountains still had gold in them, and had found more than almost anyone else, and had spent the rest of his life fighting to keep what he'd found and lost the fight, but not the gold. She told her about Earl, who had carried the secret for 60 years and built this room and paid the taxes and waited. Gracie listened with the focused attention she gave important things. He saved it for us, she said when Teresa finished. He saved it for whoever came. Next, Teresa said. He didn't know us. He just chose us. Gracie thought about this for a moment. That's still saving it for us, she said. He just didn't know our names yet. Teresa looked at her daughter. Sometimes Gracie said things that were simple and completely true and did not require any response. When the light outside the cabin began to go orange and low, Teresa called a halt. They locked the vault. The keypad accepted the same code from the inside, and the panel lifted again on its slow hydraulic breath, then settled back into place when she pressed confirm from above. She replaced all the floor planks, working quickly, setting the nails back into their original holes. From standing height, with the room swept and the boards replaced, it looked exactly as it had that morning. She sat on the porch steps in the last of the light and tried to think clearly. $425 million. Give or take, depending on the current gold price, which moved daily. She had run the numbers 6 different ways in the vault and arrived at figures between $410 million and $440 million. The variation didn't matter much. The number was enormous by any measure she had for money, enormous beyond any frame of reference she could bring to it. Having spent the last 8 months counting out grocery money in units of $5, having left Columbus with $37 in her account and an eviction notice in her jacket pocket. She thought about what her mother and Diane had said. The craft room, the used vacuum cleaner, the Facebook Marketplace car. She thought about the voice on the phone from Martin Holt telling her the property was worth $200, that everyone else had already said no, that she might make the drive and feel it wasn't worth the trip. Everyone else had said no. She had said yes for no better reason than having nowhere else to go and a stubborn refusal to let the last door close without opening it first. Earl Stanton had picked her for exactly that reason: equality. Her family treated as a liability, and her landlord had treated as irrelevance, and the job market had treated as insufficient, and he had spent 6 years planning how to make it mean something. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the trees, a branch cracked and fell. The stars were coming out above the tree line. Thousands of them. The kind of sky you only see when you're genuinely far from city lights. And Teresa sat on the porch of a sealed cabin on 12 acres of Montana land and felt the full strangeness of where she was and how she'd come to be there. The gold was real. The documents were real. The story they told was real. Silas Stanton had built something honest and had it taken from him through corruption, and had spent the rest of his life making sure that what he'd built couldn't be taken a second time. He had passed that fight down through his son and his son's son, and the last of them, a quiet old man in Billings who hadn't spoken to his family in 50 years, had aimed it carefully at a woman he'd found through a genealogy search and decided was stubborn enough not to drop it. Teresa looked at the cabin door. The brass key was in her jacket pocket, warm from being held. The floor planks were back in place above the vault. The green light was running below, steady and patient, the same as it had run for 43 years. She had to be careful. She had to be very careful, and she had to be fast. As a finder and the inheritor, Teresa had a claim. As Silas Stanton's blood descendant, she had a claim. The 1921 court ruling had never addressed the gold in the cellar because Silas had never disclosed the cellar, which meant the ruling could not have stripped rights to property the court didn't know existed. That was not a legal opinion. She was a bookkeeper, not a lawyer, but it was the clearest way she could see the situation from the outside. The gold had been legally Silas's when he extracted it. The ruling had stripped his mineral rights going forward. It had not, because it could not, strip gold already extracted and in his possession. What Cascade would argue, she suspected, was different. They would argue that all extraction during the period of the disputed mineral rights had been unauthorized, and that the gold was therefore the product of unauthorized extraction and subject to the same damages the 1921 court had assessed. Whether that argument held in a 21st century courtroom applied to documented evidence of judicial corruption, that was what she needed Sophia Yates to tell her. What she needed first was to make sure the documentation survived. Multiple copies, in multiple places, in the hands of people who could not be reached by a company with $300 million in annual revenue and a board seat that used to belong to a state senator. As the finder and the inheritor, Teresa had a claim. As Silas Stanton's blood descendant, she had a claim. What the legal framework for 100-year-old wrongdoing actually looked like, she had no idea. She took out her phone and called Martin Holt. He answered on the second ring. "Ms. Calloway, is everything all right with the property? I need to ask you something. The property, was there ever any other interest in it? Anyone besides family who tried to buy it or claim it?" A brief pause. "Why do you ask?" "Just doing due diligence on what I've inherited. I want to understand the full picture." Another pause, slightly longer. "There have been 2 purchase inquiries in the past 15 years, both from the same company, a Billings-based natural resources firm called Cascade Resources Group. They offered twice, once in 2009 at a significantly above market price for the land's assessed value, and once in 2019, just after Earl's visit in the spring. Earl declined both times through his Billings attorney. He was quite firm about it. Teresa was quiet for a moment. Did Cascade Resources ever give a reason for their interest? Mineral surveys, Martin said. They cited potential geological value. The same underground formations that make the property difficult to develop apparently also suggested possible ore deposits to their surveyors. Earl's attorney told them the land wasn't for sale. That was the end of it. He paused. "Miss Calloway, has something come up?" "I'm still just doing due diligence." "Thank you, Martin." She ended the call and sat for a long time watching the last light leave the clearing. Cascade Resources Group. Cascade Mining Corporation, incorporated in New York in 1905. The name was not a coincidence. The company that had legally stripped Earl's grandfather of his life's work had survived, changed its name, grown into a larger entity, and had been aware, at some level, that there was unresolved business on the Stanton land. They had tried to buy it twice. They had been watching it. Earl's 2019 visit, the lights Roy Griggs had seen from the road, had triggered a new purchase inquiry that same year. They'd been watching the property closely enough to notice a 2-night visit by an elderly man. They knew something was here. They didn't know what, exactly. But they had known enough to keep watching and to keep trying to buy the land. And now the land belonged to Teresa. She needed to move carefully. She needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with before she told anyone else what she'd found. She needed the kind of help that came from knowledge rather than from money, because she had very little of the latter and the situation required more of the former. She thought about the documents in the vault, about Silas Stanton's letters, about a 1921 court ruling that a dying old man had believed was corrupt, about gold bars stamped with an 1897 Montana SA office mark sitting in a climate-controlled concrete room 12 feet below where she was sitting. She went inside, lit the cabin's interior with 2 battery-powered lanterns she'd bought at the hardware store, and made dinner for Gracie on the camp stove. She'd also bought pasta with canned sauce, which Gracie ate without complaint and which tasted better than anything Teresa had prepared in months, because eating in a firelit cabin after the most extraordinary afternoon of your life had a way of improving everything. After Gracie was asleep in the sleeping bag spread on the bed frame, Teresa sat at the table with her laptop and began to research. The lantern light threw orange shadows across the wall. Outside the cabin, the pines moved in a slow wind that had picked up after dark, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. She could feel the cold coming through the old walls, but the cabin held it reasonably well, better than she'd expected, and she sat at the table in her jacket with a cup of instant coffee from the camp stove and worked through what she needed to know. She found Cascade Resources Group in 15 minutes. It was not hiding. It was a publicly listed natural resources company headquartered in Billings, operating across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Timber rights, mineral extraction, land acquisition. Annual revenues of roughly $300 million. Its website carried photographs of mountain landscapes and careful language about sustainable resource management and community partnership. The board of directors included a former state senator and 2 surnames Teresa recognized from the margins of Silas Stanton's letters, family names attached to Cascade Mining Corporation's officers in 1905 and now reappearing on board positions in the company's current form. Not the same men, obviously, more than a century removed, but the same families, across 4 generations, still connected to the institution built on what they'd taken from Silas Stanton. The early 20th century. The sanitized language around those founding years. No specific dates, no names of founders, no mention of legal disputes or court cases. She searched further. A law journal article from 2003, published in a Montana legal history journal, mineral rights litigation in the early statehood period, with a brief section on the Cascade Mining Corporation's 1905 to 1921 case against Silas Stanton. The article described it as one of several cases in which well-capitalized Eastern companies successfully challenged independent miners' claims through procedural maneuvers that, in the author's assessment, would not survive scrutiny under modern property law. It cited the case as an example of how the legal system of the period had often functioned as a tool for the transfer of wealth from individual prospectors to corporate entities. Teresa read that paragraph 3 times. She printed nothing. She downloaded nothing to any cloud service. She took screenshots with her phone and saved them locally. Then she searched for something else. Mineral rights dispute recovery, Montana legal precedent. The results were complicated. Statutes of limitations. Adverse possession. The distinction between surface rights and mineral rights. A handful of cases in which historical wrongs had been partially remedied through legislative action or negotiated settlement. One case, decided in 2019, in which a Native American family had successfully argued for the return of mineral rights stripped in the 1930s through what the court found was fraudulent documentation. The settlement had been significant. The settlement had been significant because they had documentation of the fraud. Teresa looked at the filing cabinet in her memory. The letters from Silas Stanton. The original court documents. 60 years of property tax records that demonstrated unbroken chain of custody through the Stanton family. Earl's own account. She did not know yet whether any of it would be enough, but she knew it was more than nothing. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark cabin for a while, listening to Gracie breathe in the sleeping bag across the room, and to the wind in the pines, and to the particular quality of silence that comes from being somewhere genuinely far from other people. The next morning she drove into Colder Creek early, before Martin Holt's office opened, and sat in the diner on Main Street with coffee and the same grilled cheese Gracie had ordered 3 days ago. She opened her phone to the photographs she'd taken in the vault and looked through them in order, methodically, the way she would go through an account ledger, not looking for any one thing, but building a complete picture. The bars were real. The assay marks were consistent with the period. The filing cabinet documents were what they appeared to be. The construction of the vault was precise and professional. Earl Stanton had not been a crackpot building a bunker. He had been a careful, methodical man protecting something real and significant. She called the number on Sophia Yates's card. Sophia Yates was a mineral rights attorney in Missoula whose name Teresa had found in the 2019 case she'd researched the night before. She had represented the Native American family in that settlement. Her practice listed historical property claims as a specialty. The call went to voicemail. Teresa left a careful message. Her name, that she had recently inherited a property in Colder Creek, that she had found documentation related to a historical mineral rights dispute, and that she needed to speak with someone with expertise in the area as soon as possible. She left her number. She was paying for her coffee when Roy Griggs sat down across from her. She hadn't seen him come in. He was a man in his mid-50s, broad across the shoulders, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt with a tear at one elbow. He had a weathered face and the kind of calm, deliberate manner of someone who spent most of his life working outdoors. He set his coffee cup on the table and looked at her. "You're the woman who took the Stanton place," he said. It was not a question. "Teresa Calloway. How did you know?" "Small town." He extended a hand. "Roy Griggs. I do fence repair and general maintenance out that way. I mentioned to Martin Holt that I'd seen lights at the Stanton property back in the spring of 2019. He said the old man came back for a visit." "That's right." Roy wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "2 nights. I drove past twice and saw the truck. Old blue Ford, Montana plates." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer it. But you should know that you're not the first person to take an interest in that property recently." Teresa kept her expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "About 2 weeks ago, right about when the estate filing went public with the county, I had 2 men stop by my shop asking questions about the Stanton place. Said they were from a property assessment company. Asked about the access road, the condition of the structure, whether I'd seen any unusual activity there over the years." He paused. "Professional type. Nice clothes for out here." One of them asked specifically whether I'd ever seen any vehicles on the access road at night. "Did you tell them about 2019? "I told them I didn't know anything about the property." Roy looked at her steadily. "Because I didn't like their questions. Questions about nighttime activity on someone else's property aren't questions from a property assessment company." Teresa held his gaze. "What company did they say they were from?" "Didn't give a card. Said the name was Granite Basin Associates. I looked it up afterward." He paused. "It's a subsidiary of Cascade Resources Group." The name landed with the weight she'd already been giving it. "Thank you for telling me," Teresa said. Roy nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, looking at the table for a moment. Earl Stanton paid taxes on that land for 60 years without showing his face. When he came back in 2019, he didn't stop for gas or groceries in town. Whatever he came to do, he didn't want anyone to see him doing it. A man that careful about a property, he barely used "there's a reason for that" kind of careful. He looked up. "I'm not saying I know what the reason is. I'm saying that 2 professional men from a Cascade subsidiary drove out here the week your deed transfer was filed, and they weren't asking about the cabin. They were asking about the access road at night." He paused. "So whatever Earl Stanton was being careful about for 60 years, Cascade has been wondering about it for at least as long." Teresa held his gaze. "Have they sent anyone to the property itself that you know of?" "Not that I've seen, but I drive that road most mornings." Roy set his cup down. "I live at the end of it." Teresa absorbed that. "Would you tell me if you saw something?" He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he took a business card from his shirt pocket and slid it across the table. It had a phone number handwritten on the back. "I already wrote it down for you," he said, "in case you needed it before we got around to meeting." Teresa picked up the card. Roy finished his coffee, stood, and nodded. "I knew Earl Stanton by reputation, not by introduction. People out here said he was a man of his word. Stubborn as the ground in February, but honest." He pulled on his jacket. "I figure whoever he trusted with that place is probably worth helping." He headed for the door, then stopped. "That property's been sitting there longer than either of us has been alive, Miss Calloway." One way or another, this week feels like the beginning of something. He left, and Teresa sat with his card in her hand looking out the window at the mountains. 2 weeks. Cascade Resources had known about the estate filing within 2 weeks of Earl's death. They had sent people. They had specifically asked about nighttime activity on the access road. They knew something had happened in 2019, and they were trying to determine what. The filing cabinet in the vault held documents that dated to 1921 and earlier. She had photographed all of it, but she had not yet verified the full contents of every folder. She needed to go back. She needed to do a complete inventory, photograph every single document, and get copies to people who couldn't be reached by Cascade Resources and their subsidiary shells. But first she needed to call Sophia Yates back, assuming Sophia Yates called back. She needed an attorney who understood what she was dealing with. And she needed to move carefully enough that nobody realized what she was doing until she was in a position to act. She paid for her coffee and drove back to the cabin. The day was clear and cold, the sky the deep blue that comes in November at altitude. Gracie had woken early and organized the cabin's interior in her systematic way, moving furniture a few inches in directions that seemed important to her and arranging the mason jars on the shelves by height. She had also found a bird's nest that had blown under the porch and placed it on the table as a decoration. Teresa explained, carefully, that they needed to spend the day working on the cabin and that she needed Gracie to help her do something important, a full documentation of the room below the floor. Like a record, Gracie said. Exactly like a record. Everything photographed, everything noted, so that we have proof of what's there. In case someone tries to take it, Teresa looked at her. In case anyone ever questions what we found. Gracie nodded with the seriousness the situation warranted. I'll help. They descended together this time. Teresa took a systematic inventory while Gracie held the extra light and read out the stenciled codes on each crate as Teresa photographed and logged them. It took 4 hours. Teresa documented 120 crates, all bearing Montana Assay office stamps across a date range from 1892 to 1912. She counted the bars in 12 sample crates and found each held exactly 12 ingots at a consistent weight of approximately 25 troy pounds. The total bar count was 1,440. She worked through the filing cabinet with the same thoroughness. 23 folders total. Silas Stanton's personal correspondence from 1905 to 1921, describing the discovery of the vein, the beginning of the legal dispute, and his increasing certainty that the court case was being manipulated by Cascade's attorneys who had connections to 2 of the 3 sitting judges. Technical mining reports, handwritten, detailing extraction yields year by year. The 1921 court ruling in full. A private letter from Thomas Stanton to Earl, written in 1958 after the gold had been moved from the original storage facility to a new location in Billings. A second letter from Thomas, written in 1967, instructing Earl on the relocation of the gold to the Colder Creek property once the vault construction was complete, though that letter had been written 3 years before the vault was actually built, suggesting the plan had been in development for some time. And at the very back of the filing cabinet, in a folder labeled simply E.S., Earl's own account, 15 handwritten pages. He had written it, based on the date at the top, in 2018, the year before his final visit. It described his decision to come back and check on the vault, to confirm the environmental systems were still functioning, and to update his will. He wrote about his father's instruction. He wrote about the weight of carrying a secret for 50 years, the loneliness of it, the way it shaped the decisions you made choosing not to marry because explaining the inheritance was impossible, choosing to live quietly because wealth you couldn't show anyone was wealth that existed only as an obligation. He wrote about the years when he'd considered turning everything over to the government, and the years when he'd considered finding a lawyer to pursue the 1921 case on new grounds, and why he'd always concluded that neither path led anywhere good. He was a practical man, he wrote. He understood what happened to people who tried to fight institutions larger than themselves. His grandfather had spent 16 years and everything he had fighting, and had lost anyway. What he believed, Earl wrote, was that the right person would come at the right time. He was not a religious man, he said so plainly, but he had arrived at the conviction that things held in patience sometimes found their moment, and that his job was to hold and to wait and to choose well. The passage he had written about Teresa was brief but specific, She is in difficult circumstances and has demonstrated, by remaining there, a stubbornness that suggests she doesn't give up easily. The gold should go to someone who won't give up easily. It should go to someone who has something to fight for. I cannot use it. I cannot change what was done, but she might be able to. Teresa read that paragraph, standing in the amber light of the vault with Gracie beside her, and did not move for a long time. A stubbornness that suggests she doesn't give up easily. An 89-year-old man, whom she had never met and who had never met her, had watched her from a distance through a genealogical report and decided, on the basis of a quality she'd always thought of as a liability, that she was the right person. She closed the folder. She needed to get all of this out of the vault before Cascade Resources found a way to complicate things. She needed copies in multiple locations, not just her laptop, not just her phone. Secure, off-site, in the hands of people who could not be pressured or bought. Sophia Yates returned her call at 4 that afternoon, while Teresa was back outside clearing the worst of the overgrown grass from the cabin's east side with a borrowed scythe from the hardware store. Miss Calloway. Sophia Yates's voice was clear and businesslike, the voice of someone who spent a lot of time on calls she needed to move efficiently. You mentioned a historical mineral rights dispute. Can you give me a little more detail? Teresa walked to the far edge of the clearing, away from the cabin. The original dispute involved a man named Silas Stanton, a placer and hard rock miner in what's now the Colder Creek area, and a company called Cascade Mining Corporation. 1905 to 1921. Cascade won the case and stripped the mineral rights. The ruling was, in Silas Stanton's documented opinion and based on the documentation he left, the result of judicial corruption. A pause. I know that case. It's cited in the literature as one of the more egregious examples of the period. What's your connection to it? Silas Stanton was my great-great-grandfather. I've just inherited the property from his last surviving descendant. I've found documentation I believe includes the original evidence Silas gathered about the corruption of the 1921 proceeding. And I've found the gold he extracted and stored before the ruling, over 1,400 bars bearing Montana assay office marks from 1892 through 1912, in a sealed concrete vault beneath the property. The silence on Sophia's end lasted long enough that Teresa wondered if the call had dropped. The physical gold, Sophia said finally. You're saying it's still there? On the property? Sealed in a vault Earl built in the late 1970s, yes. He maintained the environmental system for over 40 years. It's all intact. Another pause. Has anyone else seen it? No. Is the property secure? Teresa looked back at the cabin. For now. Miss Calloway, I want to be direct with you. The statute of limitations on a direct legal challenge to the 1921 ruling has long expired. You couldn't take Cascade to court and undo that judgment even with perfect documentation. But the presence of the physical gold changes things considerably. It's not just a historical claim at that point, it's recoverable property. And if the documentation demonstrates actual fraud on the court, not just procedural manipulation, but genuine corruption of the judicial process, there are avenues. State legislative remedies, negotiated settlements, potential federal involvement if the case ties into broader patterns of early statehood mineral rights abuse. She paused. It's complicated and it would take time. But it's not impossible. Cascade Resources Group has already sent people to ask questions about the property, Teresa said. They've been watching it. They know something significant is here. How recently? Within the past 2 weeks. Since the estate filing went public. Then you need to move quickly. Sophia's voice was very direct now. Get everything out of that property and into secure storage within days, not weeks. Once Cascade understands what you've found, they will use every procedural tool available to complicate your title challenges to the estate transfer, environmental objections, anything that slows you down while they build their position. What do I do in the meantime? Don't speak to anyone from Cascade or any company that represents them. Keep the documentation secure, and tell no one else what you've found. A pause. I'd like to come to Colder Creek as soon as I can. Day after tomorrow? Yes, Teresa said. Good. A brief pause. Is there anyone who already knows what you've found? Teresa looked back at the cabin. Through the uncovered windows, she could see Gracie's small silhouette moving around inside. My daughter, Teresa said. She's 7. A beat. All right. Keep it that way for now. After the call, Teresa stood at the edge of the clearing as the last light went out of the sky, and the mountains became dark shapes against a field of early stars. The cold came down sharply now, the way it does in the Montana high country at this time of year, dropping 10 degrees in the half hour around sunset. She thought about Cascade Resources, about the men who had shown up at Roy Griggs's shop asking questions about nighttime activity, about the purchase offers made in 2009 and 2019. About a company that had been built on gold it had taken from her family, and that had apparently never stopped keeping an eye on what the Stantons had done with what was left. She thought about $37 and an eviction notice and the drive to Columbus in a car loaded with everything she owned, and the phone call from a Montana attorney who had told her the property was worth next to nothing and that everyone else in the family had already said no. She thought about the amber light in the vault below her feet, and the 1,440 bars sitting in the cold on industrial shelving built by a man who believed, with the precision and patience of someone who had spent a lifetime planning for it, that one day the right person would come down those stairs and understand what to do. She'll understand what to do with it. She was beginning to. The sound reached her before she could identify it, a low, steady engine note from the direction of the access road. Not a truck or a farm vehicle. Something with a smooth, professional sound, moving without lights. Teresa did not move. She stood at the edge of the clearing in the shadow of the pine tree lean and watched. The vehicle stopped somewhere on the access road before the clearing, out of view. The engine cut. Silence came back, broken only by the wind in the upper branches, and, somewhere further in the forest, the sound of an owl's single, flat note. She waited. 30 seconds. A minute. A flashlight beam appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving low and careful, coming from the direction of the road. It swept once across the clearing, passed over the cabin, and stopped on the uncovered windows, where the lantern light inside was visible through the glass. Then a second beam appeared beside the first. Two people, moving slowly and deliberately, with the unhurried pace of people who didn't think anyone was watching them from outside. They were dressed in dark clothes. Neither was speaking. They communicated with brief hand signals, the way people communicate when they've worked together long enough not to need words. Not hikers who had lost their way. Not neighbors checking on an unfamiliar light. These were the men who had sent someone to ask Roy Griggs about nighttime activity on this road. These were the people Sophia Yates had told her to expect. They had not waited long. Teresa backed carefully into the pines, pressing herself against a tree trunk and controlling her breathing. Through the uncovered cabin windows, she could see the lantern light inside, could see Gracie's shadow moving across the wall, finishing whatever organizational project she'd been working on before dinner. The flashlight beams were moving toward the cabin in a slow, confident arc. She pulled out her phone, pressed it face down against her leg to block the screen glow, and typed the message she and Gracie had agreed on that afternoon, when Teresa had sat her daughter down and explained, as simply and honestly as she could, that there might come a time when they needed a plan. One word. 3 letters. Hide. She pressed send, then tucked the phone into her jacket pocket and pushed off from the tree trunk, moving along the edge of the clearing in the shadow of the pines, parallel to the cabin, silent on the pine duff, her heart very loud in her ears. She needed to position herself between the cabin and whoever was crossing that clearing before they reached the porch. Whatever was in the vault below the floor, she had 4 generations of stubbornness behind her and a 7-year-old daughter inside that cabin, and she was not going to step back from either of those facts without a fight. The flashlight beams moved steadily across the clearing toward the porch. Teresa moved to meet them. She stepped out of the trees. Not running, not shouting. She simply walked out of the shadow of the pine tree lean and into the clearing and stood there in the open, and the 2 flashlight beams stopped moving. Teresa had spent the 30 seconds before this moment doing one thing, calling Roy Griggs. She had pressed his number in the dark beneath the pines without looking at her phone, relying on the muscle memory of having typed a number twice since she got his card. He had answered on the second ring, and she had said, quietly, 2 men on my access road, coming to the cabin, please come now, and Roy had said he was already in his truck and to stay where she could see the road. So now she stood in the clearing and she waited, and the 2 flashlight beams did not move toward her and did not retreat. This is private property, she said. Her voice was steady. She had not planned that steadiness, but she was grateful for it. I'm the owner of record. I need you to identify yourselves. A pause. Then one of the figures moved forward, slowly, and the flashlight tilted slightly so she could see a man's outline without being blinded by the beam. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and he moved with a composed, unhurried manner that was meant to appear non-threatening and was, because of that precision, more unsettling than the alternative. "Miss Calloway," he said, "my name is David Reed. I'm a field representative for Granite Basin Associates. I apologize for the late visit. We're doing a preliminary geological survey of properties in this corridor, and I wanted to confirm the boundary markers on the east side of your land." At 10 o'clock at night, without lights on their vehicle, having parked on the access road before the clearing. "You're trespassing," Teresa said. "We have a prior access agreement with the previous owner. The previous owner died. The deed transferred to me 5 days ago, and any prior agreements transferred with it, which means they're subject to my authorization." She paused. "Which you don't have." Another pause. The second figure had stopped 20 feet behind the first and hadn't moved. A position, Teresa thought, not a casual stance. The way people stand when they've been trained to be somewhere specific. "We can reschedule," Reed said. The composure hadn't shifted at all. "I'd appreciate that." Teresa kept her voice level. "Through my attorney. Her name is Sophia Yates, out of Missoula. I'll have her contact your firm." Something passed across Reed's face in the dim light. The name had landed. He knew it. He had not expected to hear it, which told Teresa something important. They had moved quickly, but not as carefully as they thought. They'd sent a field representative before fully assessing who the new owner was and what she already knew. "Before you go," she said, and she kept her voice even, "I want you to understand something. I know who Granite Basin Associates reports to. I know the history between Cascade Resources and this property, and I know what's at stake here. So does my attorney." She paused. "If anyone comes onto this land without my authorization again, I will treat it as evidence of willful interference with pending litigation." A beat of silence. "We'll be in touch through proper channels," Reed said. "Of course," Teresa said. "I look forward to it." They left the way they'd come, the second man falling in behind the first, both flashlights extinguished as they crossed back toward the access road. Teresa did not move until she heard a vehicle engine start, and then she stood another full minute before turning and walking to the cabin. Roy Griggs's headlights appeared at the edge of the clearing 4 minutes later. He drove a battered blue truck that moved through the clearing with the sureness of someone who'd driven unpaved ground his whole life. He got out without hurrying, looked around the clearing, and came to stand beside Teresa on the porch. "They gone. 2 minutes before you got here. I passed a car on the access road going the other direction. Black SUV, no plates visible." He looked at the cabin door. "You all right?" "I'm all right." Teresa reached for the door handle. "I need to check on Gracie." She went inside and crossed the room to the bed frame. The sleeping bag was empty. "Gracie," she said, keeping her voice low. A rustling. Then Gracie's face appeared from beneath the bed frame. She had wedged herself into the narrow gap between the frame and the floor, pressed flat against the wall in the furthest corner from the door. Mr. Whiskers held against her chest with both arms. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "They're gone." Gracie slid out from under the frame and stood up, and Teresa pulled her into a hug that was harder than she'd intended. She felt her daughter's heart pounding through her pajamas. "You did exactly right," Teresa said into her hair. "Exactly right." "Mr. Whiskers was scared," Gracie said. "But I told him we had a plan." Teresa held her for a long moment and did not say anything. Roy came in without being invited, which felt correct, and stood by the door looking around the room with the systematic attention of a man who noticed things. He did not say anything about the section of flooring in the center of the room, though she saw his eyes go to it and stay there a fraction of a second longer than the rest of the room. "They'll come back," he said. "I know. Not like that. Next time it'll be through a lawyer." He looked at her directly. "Whatever they think is here, they've decided it's worth pursuing properly. I've already called an attorney. She's coming the day after tomorrow." Roy nodded. "I'll park at the bottom of the access road tonight. Give you warning if anyone comes back." He held up a hand before she could speak. "Not a question. Just telling you what I'm doing." Teresa looked at this man she had met 48 hours ago in a diner, who had written his number down in advance because he'd thought she might need it, who was now offering to sit in his truck all night on a county road for a woman he didn't know. She thought about all the people who had told her the property wasn't worth the trip who had offered the craft room, who had said be careful and meant come home. And here was a man she barely knew doing the opposite of all of them. Thank you, she said. Earl Stanton paid his taxes, Roy said simply. That's not nothing, where I'm from. He turned and went back to his truck. Teresa spent the next 2 hours doing what Sophia Yates had told her to do. She photographed every remaining document in the filing cabinet, every page of every folder, working carefully by lantern light. She created a compressed file on her laptop and emailed it to Sophia's secure server. She created a second copy on a USB drive sealed in an envelope addressed to Martin Holt, to be left at his office first thing in the morning. She worked with the systematic focus that 8 years of bookkeeping had built into her. Accurate, complete, no shortcuts. When she finished, she locked the vault, replaced the floor planks, swept the section clean. From standing height, it looked exactly as it had that morning. She sat at the table with the last of the camp stove coffee and listened to her daughter sleep and to the cold wind outside and to the sound of Roy Griggs's truck engine, very distant, at the bottom of the access road. She thought about the 2 men crossing her clearing, about the composed, professional patience in Reed's voice, about a company that had spent 100 years assuming that the families it had wronged were too poor and too scattered to come back, about what it meant that they'd sent a field representative the same week the estate transfer was filed, before Teresa had even had time to open every door in the place. They had not expected Sophia Yates's name. They had not expected a woman with $37 and an eviction notice to walk out of the Montana pine trees at 10 o'clock at night and name their parent company to their face. They had expected someone who didn't know what she had. Silas Stanton had known what he had. He'd known for 16 years of legal battles, and he'd protected it anyway, bar by bar, letter by letter, with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the truth needed time to find its moment. Teresa turned off the lantern. In the darkness of the cabin, through the gap between 2 floor planks she hadn't quite seated back perfectly, a thin thread of green rose from below. Steady and quiet. She sat with it for a while. Then she went asleep. Outside, at the end of the access road, Roy Griggs's truck sat with its engine off and its windows cracked open to the cold Montana night. Teresa sat in the amber lantern light of a sealed cabin on 12 acres of land and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not facing something alone. Sophia Yates arrived on a Tuesday morning in a green Subaru with a Missoula law firm's name on a magnetic door placard and a cargo area full of equipment cases. She was in her early 40s, lean and direct, with the focused energy of someone who spent most of her working life preparing for exactly the kind of fight Teresa had described on the phone. She shook Teresa's hand at the cabin door, shook Gracie's hand with the same seriousness, and set her laptop bag on the kitchen table before she'd been inside 90 seconds. Behind her came a man named Dr. Warren Chu, who introduced himself as a forensic metallurgist from the University of Montana's Department of Earth Sciences. He had a canvas equipment bag over one shoulder and the unhurried, precise manner of someone who had spent 30 years examining the physical world for what it was actually made of, and who had stopped being surprised by what he found a long time ago. Before we do anything else, Sophia said, I need to see the documentation. Teresa unlocked the vault. She watched Sophia's face as she descended the steps and stood in the vault for the first time. The attorney's expression did not change dramatically. She was not a woman who showed her reactions easily, but something in her posture shifted at the bottom of the stairs, the way posture shifts when you encounter something that exceeds what you prepared yourself for. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in the shelving units and the crates and the amber light, and then she walked directly to the filing cabinet and opened the top drawer and began to read. She read for 40 minutes. She did not speak. She turned pages with the systematic precision of someone building a case in real time, occasionally photographing a document with her phone, occasionally making a brief note on the yellow legal pad she'd carried down. Dr. Chu, meanwhile, had taken a crate from the nearest shelf and carried it to the table in the corner. He opened it with practiced care, lifted out one bar, and set it on the metal table surface. He spent several minutes examining it with a loupe and a portable spectrometer from his equipment bag, running the instrument across the surface with quiet, steady movements. He lifted a second bar, a third. He weighed each one on a small digital scale and recorded the numbers in his notebook. He worked through the better part of an hour before he set down his instruments. Then he stood back and looked at Teresa with the expression of someone who has confirmed what they expected and is being honest about the significance of it. "These are genuine," he said. "High-purity gold, consistent with late 19th and early 20th century refining methods. The assay marks are authentic Montana assay office stamps I can verify against the historical archive records, but these are not reproductions or forgeries. The alloy composition, the casting method, the stamp geometry, all of it matches the period." He picked up one bar and held it in both hands, the weight settling in his palms. "This gold was cast and stamped between 1892 and 1912. It has never been refined or reprocessed. Nothing in this room has been altered or fabricated." He set the bar down carefully. "This is exactly what it appears to be." The room was quiet for a moment. Sophia looked up from the filing cabinet. "The documentation is extraordinary," she said. "Silas Stanton was meticulous. His letters are detailed, dated, internally consistent, and corroborated by the technical mining reports. The 1921 court ruling is here in full, along with his own annotations identifying the procedural irregularities he believed were corrupt." She closed a folder. "This isn't a rumor or a family legend. This is a documented record of a specific legal wrong, assembled by the man it was done to, preserved through 3 generations, and now sitting in front of me intact." "Is it enough?" Teresa asked. Sophia was quiet for a moment. "For a direct challenge to the 1921 judgment, no, that case is closed. But I've been working on historical mineral rights cases for 15 years, and this is the most complete contemporary documentation of judicial corruption in the early statehood period I have ever seen. Combined with the physical gold and the chain of custody through the Stanton family, 3 generations of maintained secrecy, documented through letters and tax records and Earl's own account, this is the foundation for a claim that goes to the state attorney general and potentially to federal investigators." She paused. "The key question is whether we can establish that the gold itself was never legally subject to the 1921 ruling. My argument is that it wasn't." She walked Teresa through it. The ruling stripped Silas's mineral rights going forward. It could not retroactively reach back and criminalize property already in his possession at the time it was handed down. The gold was his when he put it in the ground. It was Earl's when Earl moved it. It was Teresa's now. Will Cascade agree with that argument? Sophia's dry smile reappeared briefly. Cascade will argue the opposite with every resource they have, which is why we're going to move faster than they expect. She pulled out her laptop and opened a document she had clearly been working on before she drove to Colder Creek. "I'm filing a preemptive declaratory judgment claim with the Montana District Court today. It formally establishes your ownership of the contents of this vault and asks the court to confirm that the 1921 ruling applies only to mineral extraction rights from the land, not to personal property extracted and stored prior to the ruling. Simultaneously, I'm submitting a complaint to the State Attorney General's Historical Equity Division, which was created specifically to review cases of alleged fraud in early statehood legal proceedings. And I have a contact at the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section who has been following Cascade Resources' land acquisition practices for 3 years." She looked at Teresa steadily. "Cascade has been doing this kind of thing for a long time. Your great-great-grandfather's case is not the only one in their history. You are going to be very useful to some people who have been waiting for the right documentation." The implications of that settled over Teresa slowly. She was not just fighting for the gold. She was about to hand a century-old company a problem that went far beyond this clearing in Montana. "How long does it take?" she asked. "The declaratory judgment several months for a full ruling, but the filing itself creates an immediate legal freeze. Cascade cannot take any action affecting this property while it's pending. The Attorney General investigation years, potentially. The DOJ interest I honestly don't know. But the moment I file today, this situation moves from private to official. They can no longer operate in the dark." Teresa looked at the vault around her, at the amber light, at the crates on the shelving units, at the filing cabinet holding Silas Stanton's careful, painstaking record of what had been done to him. "File it," she said. Sophia opened a new tab on her laptop and began to type. Dr. Chu spent 2 more hours in the vault completing his assessment. His final count confirmed 1,440 bars. His spectrometer readings, cross-referenced against his university's database of historical Montana gold samples, placed the gold's likely source in the geological formation east of Colder Creek that corresponded precisely to where Silas Stanton's original claim had been staked. The purity averaged 96%. At current market prices, accounting for the historical premium that antique assay bars commanded above spot price, his preliminary valuation came to $427 million. He wrote that number in his field notebook in pencil, underlined it once, and showed it to Teresa. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the floor of the cabin above them, at the same floor she'd been sitting on when she was trying to figure out whether a pound of ground turkey could stretch to 3 dinners. $37 and an eviction notice, she thought. That was the distance between where she'd started and where she was standing. Sophia filed the declaratory judgment claim from the cabin's kitchen table, using Teresa's phone as a hotspot, at 2:47 that afternoon. The filing went to the district court in Billings and was time-stamped and docketed within the hour. She sent simultaneous notice to the state attorney general's office and forwarded Dr. Chu's preliminary assessment as supporting documentation. Martin Holt called at 4:15. He had received the court filing notification in his capacity as the estate attorney on record. He was quiet for a long moment on the phone before speaking. "Miss Calloway," he said, "when I told you the property was worth $200, I was telling you the truth as I understood it." "I know you were," Teresa said. "I'm glad you came anyway." "So am I." Another brief silence. "I should tell you something. When Cascade Resources made their second purchase offer in 2019, the one after Earl's visit, their representative told Earl's Billings attorney that the offer was above market because they had reason to believe the property had geological value. Earl's attorney told me at the time that it seemed like a bluff, a fishing offer, to see if Earl knew something and could be bought out quietly." He paused. Earl said no without asking what the reason was. He didn't ask because he already knew what they thought was there. He just didn't want them to know that he knew. Teresa thought about that. An 84-year-old man fielding a purchase offer from a company founded on gold stolen from his grandfather, turning them down without showing a single card. "He was careful," she said. "He was very careful," Martin agreed. "I think he would be pleased." The court filing changed everything in ways Teresa had not fully anticipated. By the following morning, word had reached a reporter at the Billings Gazette who covered property and land rights cases and had been tracking Cascade Resources' acquisition patterns for a series of articles he'd been working on for 2 years. He called Sophia's office at 9. Sophia called Teresa at 9:15. "Your name is going to be public," Sophia said. "The court filing is public record. How do you want to handle it?" Teresa thought about the 2 men who had crossed her clearing in the dark, about the purchase offers in 2009 and 2019, about the men in nice clothes asking Roy Griggs about nighttime activity on a private road, about a company that had spent 100 years operating in the comfortable certainty that the people it had wronged were too poor and too isolated to fight back. "Tell him to call me directly," she said. The Billings Gazette story ran 3 days later, above the fold on the front page, beneath a photograph of the cabin taken from the clearing with the mountains behind it. The headline read, "Montana woman claims $427 million gold cash in inherited cabin, files against Cascade Resources in historic mineral rights dispute." By that afternoon, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By the next morning, it was national. The story had everything: the eviction notice, the single mother, the dollar amount, the century-old conspiracy, the little girl who had first seen the light. Reporters called Martin Holt's office. They drove up the access road and parked at the edge of the clearing and took photographs of the cabin with the mountains behind it. Teresa spoke to 2 of them, briefly and carefully, and let the facts of the case speak for themselves. The headline in the Billings Gazette, "Single mother claims $427 million gold cash in inherited cabin, files against Cascade Resources in historic mineral rights dispute," was restrained and accurate. Some of the national outlets were less restrained. One ran the headline, "Mom with $37 to her name inherits cabin no one wanted. Now she's worth $192 million, which was technically accurate and felt, to Teresa, like it missed the point entirely. The point was not the money. The money was the outcome, not the story. The story was Silas Stanton writing letters in 1910, carefully, in small, precise handwriting, because he understood that the truth needed to be held onto and passed down and trusted to find its moment. The story was a family, across 4 generations, keeping that faith without knowing if it would ever matter. The point was a brass key and a gravel road and a 7-year-old saying, "There's light coming from underground." What she did not discuss publicly was what it had felt like to read those letters aloud at the kitchen table, Gracie's questions coming at every paragraph, the particular quality of that evening's lantern light on the old pages. Those things were not for the news. They were for the cabin, for the 2 of them, for the specific weight of 100 years of a family she hadn't known she belonged to until she drove up a rutted gravel road on a November afternoon with nowhere particular to go. Her mother called at 7 in the morning, Ohio time, before Teresa had finished her coffee. There was a long silence after Teresa answered before Linda Calloway spoke. "I saw it online," her mother said. "The story." "I know." Another silence. Her mother's voice, when it came back, was different from the voices Teresa had been hearing from her for months, not the measured, careful kindness that held a verdict underneath it, but something more uncertain. Something that sounded, at its edges, like a woman who had said the wrong thing and knew it and was not entirely sure how to say so. "Teresa," she said, "I told you it wasn't worth the trip." "You did." "I was wrong." A pause. "I was very wrong, and I should say so plainly. I was wrong and you were right, and I'm very proud of you. Even though I shouldn't take any credit for it when I told you not to go." Teresa sat with that for a moment. She thought about the 11-minute phone call in October, about the craft room, about the used vacuum cleaner comparison. She thought about her mother, who had a particular way of showing love that sometimes looked like doubt, and who had been looking at her daughter's life through the lens of a fear that nothing would work out, a fear that had its own history, its own reasons. A woman who had watched Teresa struggle for 8 months and had not been wrong to worry, just wrong to assume that struggling meant failing. "You weren't wrong to be worried," Teresa said. "It was a real risk. It was a real risk that paid off because you're stubborn." Her mother's voice had something in it now that was almost a laugh and almost tears, and was in fact both at once. "Which you got from me, for the record. I'm just better at hiding it." Teresa laughed. "It felt good. I know where I got it. Will you bring Gracie to see me? When things settle?" "Yes. Soon." "She's all right." All of this, it wasn't too much for her. Teresa looked over at the table where Gracie was eating toast and drawing something in her sketchbook with total concentration, completely unconcerned with the national news stories about her mother. "She's completely fine. She's already explained the hydraulic vault door mechanism to Roy's wife twice." Her mother made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. "She's your daughter, all right," Diane called 20 minutes later. Her opening was characteristically direct. "I can't believe you didn't call me the moment you found it." "I couldn't tell anyone." Attorney's instructions. "For 9 months. Sophia was very clear. A pause. 9 months of knowing you were sitting on $400 million in a Montana cabin and you couldn't tell your sister. "I know. That must have been incredibly difficult for you," Diane said, with the precise tone that meant the opposite. "It really was." "Was the craft room ever actually an option in your mind?" "Honestly, for about 4 seconds." Teresa smiled. "Before I hung up the phone with Martin Holt." Diane laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that dissolves tension that has been building for a long time. "For what it's worth, I was wrong too. I should have said go and see instead of don't bother. You always were better at the long shots than me." "You were being practical. I was being small," Diane said simply. "There's a difference. You should know that I am your loudest supporter going forward, and I am fully taking credit for raising you to be this way. You're 4 years older than me. I was a formative influence." They talked for half an hour, and by the end of it something that had been tight between them for months had loosened a little, the way things do when a period of strain finally resolves, and you can look back at it from the other side and see it whole. Roy Griggs knocked on the cabin door that afternoon with a casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel and said his wife had made it because she thought Teresa had probably been too busy to cook. Teresa accepted it, thanked him, and set it on the table, and Gracie immediately wanted to know what was in it, and Roy's wife had made something with elk and vegetables that turned out to be the best dinner any of them had eaten in months. Roy stayed for coffee after, and Teresa told him the full story, everything, from Silas Stanton's original find to the amber light and the filing cabinet, and the $427 million sitting in a vault beneath, where he was currently drinking from a chipped ceramic mug. He listened the way he did everything completely, without interrupting, with the attention of a man who understood that some things deserved to be heard all the way through. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Earl Stanton drove past my shop twice when he came back in 2019, Roy said. I watched him from the window both times. Old man in a blue truck, driving slow. I figured he was just looking at the land before he died. He turned his cup in his hands. I wonder now if he drove past to see who the neighbors were, to see if there was someone worth trusting within driving distance. He looked at Teresa. I think he decided there was. The legal proceedings moved the way legal proceedings always do, not quickly, not in a straight line, but with a momentum that built on itself as the documentation proved out. Sophia Yates's declaratory judgment claim moved through the district court. Cascade Resources filed their anticipated opposition, citing the 1921 ruling and arguing that any gold extracted from the disputed land during the period of contested mineral rights was subject to the damages the ruling had assessed. Their attorneys were good. They filed thorough, well-researched documents. They had done this kind of thing before, but they had not had documentation like Silas Stanton's letters before. The judge, a woman named Sandra Illes, who had spent 20 years on the Montana bench, issued a preliminary ruling in Teresa's favor within 6 weeks. The 1921 ruling had addressed mineral rights. The gold at issue had been cast into bars and stored as personal property before the ruling was handed down. The ruling could not retroactively reach back and claim property that had been in Silas Stanton's possession at the time it was issued. The logic was clean and the precedent held. Cascade appealed. The Attorney General's historical equity investigation, meanwhile, had opened formally. A historian from Montana State University who had spent a decade studying early statehood judicial corruption was brought in as an expert. She confirmed within 3 months that Judge Aldrich, who had ruled against Silas in 1921, had held a personal financial interest in 3 companies with business ties to Cascade Mining Corporation at the time of the ruling. The interest had never been disclosed. It had sat in probate records for over 100 years, waiting for someone to look. The Attorney General filed a formal complaint with the state Supreme Court's Historical Records Commission. The DOJ inquiry, which Sophia's contact had mentioned, materialized quietly and expanded to include not just the Stanton property, but a pattern of Cascade acquisitions that showed the same procedural signature across 5 decades. The settlement offer came from Cascade's attorneys 8 months after the declaratory filing. Their board had done the math. The historical fraud documentation, the DOJ interest, the Attorney General complaint, the national press attention, any one of these was manageable. All 4 together were not. They wanted the case closed. They were willing to pay to close it. Sophia brought the offer to Teresa at the cabin table and laid out the terms. The numbers were significant. The conditions were minimal. The case would be settled without trial, without a full public airing of Cascade's founding history, and without any formal admission of fraud. Teresa asked one question: does agreeing to this settlement prevent the Attorney General's investigation from continuing? Sophia said no. The settlement was a civil matter between private parties. The state investigation ran independently. Teresa said, then accepted. The consent agreement was signed on a Tuesday. Cascade Resources acknowledged the historical legitimacy of the Stanton family's claim to the gold extracted prior to the 1921 ruling. They made no admission of fraud. Their attorneys had been clear that admission of fraud was not available, but the acknowledgement was public and binding. They agreed to release any claim to the physical gold in the vault. The historical equity investigation continued independently and was not subject to the settlement's terms. The full transfer took another 4 months. Federal tax filings, an estate valuation hearing, the movement of over 1,400 gold bars from a concrete vault in a Montana foothills clearing to a secure facility in Billings where they were formally assessed, cataloged, and registered. Dr. Chu supervised the assessment across 8 weeks. His final valuation came to $427,300,000. After federal and state taxes, after legal fees that were substantial but, as Sophia pointed out with quiet satisfaction, a fraction of what they might have been if the case had gone to full trial. After every cost and obligation had been settled, $192 million, net, transferred to the account of Teresa and Calloway. $192 million. From a property assessed at $200. She sat in Martin Holt's office above the hardware store in Colder Creek on a Thursday afternoon in August, almost 9 months after she had first climbed those stairs with a tarnished brass key and $37 to her name, and looked at the settlement confirmation on the document in front of her for a long time. Gracie was downstairs in the hardware store with Roy's wife, Janet, who had taken her for the afternoon. It was a warm August day, and the mountains were green and sharp against the blue sky through Martin's window, the same mountains that had been there every day of this, entirely unchanged. Martin slid the document across the desk. "There are very few moments in this job," he said quietly, "where I feel like the right thing happened. This is one of them." He said it without ceremony, in the same measured tone he'd used the first time she'd sat across this desk from him, when he'd been honest about the $200 assessment and the washed-out access road, and the fact that everyone else had already said no. She had liked him for that from the beginning. The directness, the absence of performance. He had given her the truth and let her make the decision. Teresa looked at the number on the document. $192 million, net of taxes and legal fees, transferred to the account of Teresa and Calloway. A second line confirmed the title to the property, 12 acres in the foothills east of Colder Creek, assessed at $200, now registered as historically significant, the deed in her name, without condition or challenge. She looked at the document for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She was not a sentimental person by nature. She was, as Silas Stanton had apparently been, a practical person who believed in doing the next thing thoroughly and not making too much noise about it. But she sat in that chair and let herself feel the full weight of this for a minute, because it seemed important not to rush past it. The distance between where she had been and where she was, the specific and improbable sequence of events that connected $37 and an eviction notice to this afternoon in this office in this town. She thought about Silas Stanton in 1905, watching the lawyers arrive with their documents and their certainty that a man of modest means could be dispossessed by people with enough money and patience. She thought about 16 years of fighting and losing and still, with what he had left, putting the gold in the ground and writing it down and trusting that the truth could wait longer than injustice could stand. She thought about Thomas Stanton moving the gold through the Depression, paying storage fees under a false company name, keeping the secret through 30 years. She thought about Earl building this vault at 60 years old with careful hands, running the wiring, pouring the concrete, scratching a number into a wall where the right person would find it, and then driving away and paying 60 more years of taxes and living quietly and commissioning a genealogy search at 83 because he needed to find someone worth trusting with what he'd spent his life protecting. She thought about $37 and a stack of past due bills and a 7-year-old in dinosaur pajamas asking if it was a bad news day. Teresa picked up the pen and signed the document. Outside, the August light fell across the mountains the way it always did, clean and unhurried, and the town of Colder Creek went about its Thursday in the way small towns do, the hardware store and the diner and the church with its sign out front and the mountains behind everything, enormous and certain. In the months after the settlement, Teresa did not move away. This surprised people. The national news stories that followed the announcement, a single mother inherits derelict cabin worth $200, wins $192 million in century-old gold dispute, generated the kind of attention that comes with a story so specific and so unlikely that it doesn't fit any existing template. Reporters wanted to know where she was going, what she was buying, how the money had changed her life. Several assumed Montana was a stop, not a destination. She was from Ohio, after all. Surely she'd go back east, or go somewhere warm, or go anywhere that wasn't a 12-acre clearing in the foothills of a mountain range most people couldn't name. She didn't leave. She stayed in Colder Creek because Gracie had started school there and had made 3 friends and was learning the names of all the birds that came to the clearing in winter. She stayed because the mountains were where she'd found out what she was actually capable of when she'd had to find out. She stayed because the cabin on Ridgeback Road was where a man she'd never met had aimed a century of careful, patient work, and it seemed like the right thing to stay and build on what he'd built rather than simply take the inheritance and disappear. The debt was the first thing to go. The credit card balances, the storage unit in Columbus where the rest of her things had been sitting for months, the medical bills that had accumulated in the years before she'd stopped having health insurance. She paid all of it in the same week the first settlement funds cleared, working through the list methodically the way she would have worked through any ledger. Thoroughly, completely, leaving nothing outstanding. There was a particular satisfaction to it that she hadn't fully anticipated. Not joy exactly. More like the physical sensation of setting down something heavy. She paid for Gracie's school in Colder Creek for the next 10 years. Not a fund. Just a direct gift to the school district's endowment. Because the school was small and underfunded and had one teacher who did 3 grade levels at once, and that teacher deserved better resources and a stable budget, and she had the means to provide both. She established the foundation. The Stanton Historical Equity Foundation, which funded legal representation for families and communities facing mineral rights disputes across the Mountain West. Sophia Yates agreed to serve on the board in an advisory capacity. Dr. Chu agreed to serve as a technical consultant. Martin Holt, to Teresa's mild surprise, agreed to serve as the Montana liaison when she asked him directly over coffee in his office. He had been quiet for a moment, and then said yes with the manner of a man who had been hoping for exactly this kind of ask. She hired a contractor from Billings to restore the cabin properly. The original log construction was preserved where possible, everything else rebuilt to last: real insulation, real plumbing, a propane furnace for the Montana winters, a kitchen where the camp stove had been. The porch was rebuilt from the ground up, the sagging east end raised and leveled, new boards fitted and sealed. The work took 4 months, and during those months Teresa and Gracie lived at the Ridgeback Inn, in the same room with the brown floral bedspread where this had all begun, and Gracie found this deeply satisfying in a way she explained several times to anyone who asked. The coat rack was kept. The kerosene lantern on the table was kept. The mason jars on the shelves were kept. The cabin was no longer sealed and dark, but it was still recognizably the place Earl Stanton had left and Teresa had opened, and that felt right. The vault remained below the floor, sealed and empty now, the gold in a registered facility in Billings, the documents preserved by Sophia's office in a climate-controlled archive. Teresa had the vault registered as a historic structure and had a small plaque installed on the cabin wall outside. On this property, Silas Reeves Stanton, 1858 to 1931, preserved the record of an injustice and waited for it to be made right. Roy Griggs did the ongoing maintenance on the property, as he had apparently planned to from the moment he walked into her cabin with a casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel. He refused payment for the first year on the grounds that he was just being neighborly, and accepted it the second year when Teresa made clear she considered him the only person in Colder Creek she fully trusted and wanted him compensated appropriately. His wife Janet became Gracie's unofficial second grandmother and taught her to bake and to identify animal tracks and to read the weather from the shape of the clouds over the North Ridge, a skill Gracie embraced with her characteristic thoroughness, informing Teresa each morning what the day would bring based on the sky conditions. Gracie turned 8 in the restored cabin, with a birthday party attended by 8 children from her Colder Creek school and Roy and Janet and Sophia Yates, who had made the drive from Missoula because she said there was no case in her career she was more proud of, and she wanted to see the property in its finished condition. Gracie showed the vault door to everyone who hadn't seen it yet, through the open floor planks with the green indicator light running steady in the darkness below, explaining the hydraulic mechanism and the keypad, and where the code had been scratched into the wall, with the patience and precision of a tour guide who genuinely loved the subject. Sophia stood on the porch afterward in the late afternoon light and looked out at the clearing and the pines and the mountains behind everything. The exact same view she'd first seen in the photographs from the news stories, now real and three-dimensional around her. "Do you think Earl knew how it would turn out?" she asked. Teresa had thought about this many times. "No," she said. "I don't think he knew the details. I think he just believed it would, eventually. He was built that way." She said it and understood, as she said it, that it was true of more than Earl. Stubbornness was not a glamorous quality. People did not generally celebrate it. It was not intelligence or charm or particular talent. It was just the refusal to stop, the refusal to let the last door close without trying it, the willingness to drive 1,100 miles for a cabin assessed at $200 when everyone you knew had told you it wasn't worth the trip. It was what Silas Stanton had carried into a courtroom for 16 years. What Thomas Stanton had carried through 30 years of secret storage fees. What Earl Stanton had carried through 60 years of property taxes and patience and careful, precise planning. What Teresa Calloway had carried out of Columbus on a gray Thursday morning with $37 in her account and nothing ahead of her but the possibility that something might be different if she went toward it instead of away. Gracie had a bedroom with a window that looked out at the mountains. She went to sleep most nights watching the last light leave the peaks, that particular orange and gold that comes in the last 10 minutes before the sky goes dark over the Montana high country. And she had developed a habit of narrating what she saw to Mr. Whiskers in a low, serious voice, describing the clouds and the ridgelines and the way the light changed on the snow. Teresa would stand in the doorway some evenings and listen to this, and feel something she did not have a precise word for, not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was in it, and not relief, though relief was in it too. More like the sense of having come to the end of something long and landed somewhere real. The way you feel when you set down a weight you've been carrying so long you'd stop noticing it. Gracie's friends at school knew the broad version of the story. It was, after all, national news. They had asked her about it in the direct, unbothered way children ask about things, and Gracie had answered them with the same quality matter of fact, complete, without drama. She had found treasure in the floor. Her mom had gone to court. Now they lived here. She had taken them to see the vault on playdates, the way other children might show, visiting friends at trampoline or a swimming pool. None of them had met Earl Stanton. None of them knew what Silas Stanton looked like or how his handwriting appeared on a letter from 1910. But Gracie had read those letters. Teresa had read them aloud to her over 3 evenings in the autumn after the cabin was restored, sitting at the kitchen table with the original documents preserved behind their archival plastic, working through Silas's careful handwriting together. Gracie had asked questions at every paragraph. Why did they do that to him? What does this word mean? Did he know it would work out? Did he ever give up? Teresa had answered every one honestly, including the last one. She had told Gracie that she didn't know if Silas knew it would work out, that sometimes people did the right thing without knowing whether it would be enough, that the not knowing was the hardest part and also, in some way, the most important part, because if you only did the right thing when you were certain it would be rewarded, it wasn't really the right thing you were doing. Gracie had thought about this for a moment and then said, like returning a lost thing even if no one sees you do it. Teresa had said, exactly like that. It was what the whole story was, really. A lost thing returned across 4 generations, across 100 years of courts and secrecy and patience, and a single brass key worn smooth from sitting in a drawer. A wrong made right not by a single dramatic act, but by a succession of small decisions to protect, to preserve, to keep paying the taxes, to choose the right person, to drive 1,100 miles and try the door. Outside the restored cabin, on the wall beside the front door, the plaque for Silas Stanton caught the morning light the way the gold bars had once caught the amber light of the vault below. Not glowing, just present, solid and real, and exactly where it was supposed to be. Teresa Calloway, who had left Columbus with $37 and an eviction notice, who had said yes to a trip nobody thought was worth the trip, who had crouched on a swept wooden floor in an old November light, while her daughter pointed at a thread of green rising from the dark below. That woman lived on 12 acres in the Montana foothills and paid her taxes on time and read her daughter's letters from school and walked out to the clearing in the evenings to watch the light change on the mountains and did not take any of it for granted, not a single day. The gold was gone from under the floor. The green light still ran in the empty vault below because the battery Earl had installed had decades left in it, and there was no reason to change what worked. On some evenings, if you pulled back the floor planks and lay flat on the floorboards with your face over the opening, you could see it, that thin thread of green light rising from the darkness below, steady and quiet, the same as it had been for all those years before anyone came to find it. Gracie had shown this to every friend she'd brought home since the cabin was restored. She had a script for it, refined through repetition into something precise and unhurried. She would have them lie flat on the floor and look down, and she would say, "That's the light that was running when my mom found it. Nobody knew it was there. It was just waiting." They would lie there looking at it for a moment, the green thread rising from below, and then Gracie would say, "She came anyway, even when everyone told her not to. And that's why we're here." Teresa heard her say it once from across the room and did not correct any part of it, because there was nothing in it that needed correcting. It was the whole story in 3 sentences. It was the truth, as clearly and simply as truth gets said. She came anyway. That's why they were here. Outside the cabin, the Montana evening settled over the clearing the way it always did, the mountains going blue, then dark, then invisible against the sky, the pines holding still in the last warmth of the day, the clearing quiet and specific and real. Somewhere in the forest to the north, an owl called once and did not call again. The Ridgeback Road ran down through the pines to the county gravel, and the county gravel ran to the highway, and the highway ran to Colder Creek, and Colder Creek sat at the foot of mountains that had been there long before any of this, long before Silas Stanton walked into these foothills with $40 and a belief that honest work had a future here. It still did. It had just taken a while. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.